And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I have the song for Kamala Harris,
Okay.
the Democrat candidate for president, VP, unfortunately. And it is The Great Pretender.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you better thank a union member.
Mm-hmm.
This was the speech that was supposed to put her over the line, as it were. And it was a huge setback for the Democrat ticket. And along with her heavy emphasis on getting rid of free speech and cracking down on people talking on social media networks, as if they haven't done that enough already. But we've been seeing it quite a bit, including a case by the Justice Department trying to limit the influence of all these terrible Russia on the American elections. And of course, you got China right in the heart of things, Israel, all these other countries doing the exact same thing. And we do it over there as well. So no big surprises there, but they love that Russia when they got nothing else going on and they have a bomb of a candidate like Harris and Waltz. So I think is a terrible pick for VP. You know, just straight up based on his record. So, but the 2024 election is the crucial aspect of things going on. And although tonight's episode is not on it, I wanted to say a couple of things about it before we start. Of course, tonight's episode is major, and this is a huge blowout of an episode, X Series 175. This is Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, Castro, Cuba, and the Atlantis mystery. There are some facts that are going to be revealed in this episode that are going to really open our eyes in relation to the history of the Hot Zone and what's really going on there. And seemingly this little island in the middle of nowhere, right there off the coast of Florida, somehow spurs us into things like World War III and just dramatic episodes in history. And when I get my own kind of bearings around it, I've always wondered about some of the things that were going on in relation to Cuba, Bimini, and in, you know, Andros and other places like where we have Autec, for example. And it's so, there's so much attention, so much focus there. And it's interesting. You could say, well, it's for this reason, it's for drug running, it's for, you know, all the different things, but it applies to all those different islands. And all those different islands down there in the Hot Zone do not occupy the place that Cuba has occupied in our history and with everything that's going on. And is always the ping pong ball between Russia and the United States. I'm going to get into what the real truth is about the Hot Zone, and it is directly related to Atlantis. And around it is this gigantic geopolitical history, including the CIA, the mob, assassinations, the political side, etc. But underneath it is an unavoidable fact, which is there's something there in the Hot Zone that relates to our ancient past. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, the Castro Atlantis mystery. I want to remind you that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And, you know, basically Olivia's going to put those together. You can ask them anytime during the show. And in the last hour of the show, we'll take those. And we're going to go a couple hours with you here tonight. But before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Everyone is super enthusiastic. Alex Leggett says, I never miss an episode of Dark Journalist Live. And Thomas M. says, this is going to be one hell of an episode. I know it.
Yes. Well, it all follows off of a documentary I put. I have the first part of a 6-part documentary series that we filmed with a really fantastic crew, and it's called The CRAZE in the Hot Zone, and it's Hacking Atlantis. And so part 1 is The CRAZE in the Hot Zone, but this lays out the scenario that we've been building here in 30 some odd episodes of the Hot Zone. And it's interesting because the Hot Zone is so important because it is that area that we do have access to, after all. I mean, the Bahamas occupy a great part of it. It's right off the coast of Florida, and it occupies this territory between the Yucatan Peninsula, western tip of Cuba, Miami, Bimini, Andros. That whole piece has come to be known as the Hot Zone in these episodes. And we named it that because when I was investigating, I got a number of military people, private contractors, and others who were telling me there were areas down there where they had to sign NDAs when they got around certain things. So if you saw something like large ruins, for example, you couldn't disclose that. You couldn't give a press conference. As a private citizen, you were under obligation if you're down there not to say anything about it. And that got my attention. I'd already, since I've been reading so many things around the mystery schools, et cetera, about this area, the Bahamas, Bimini, Cuba, that whole piece, which borders right there, of course, in the Bermuda Triangle. And this whole time, it's become very clear to me that something very, very unusual is going on there. And in the mystery school tracks, you'll get that this was the last kind of major bastion of Atlantis. And in the Cayce work, Sleeping Prophet Edgar Cayce, he calls it Poseidia, which was the main center of this Amelius group, who wanted to use the high advanced technology of the Atlanteans in a spiritual fashion versus this other group, the Sons of Belial, these kind of Ahrimanic technology types. And that there was a huge battle that played out way, way back. 10,000 BC was the end of that battle. And the outgrowth, the kind of dispersion, the dissolution of the whole thing went to the various corners of the earth, including Mexico, Egypt, Peru, and other places, and started a whole new wave of civilization. But that memory was always back there. Now, there are very interesting things if you get into the Cayce readings dealing with this alone. And this is what's so fascinating about it, is I started to find strange things in relation to Bimini about Ernest Hemingway. And this is probably almost 10 years ago when I was first looking into this around Hemingway. And then I started to realize when I went through the readings, we brought forward things on this show in relation to the HotZone about Hemingway and him getting readings through his mother from Edgar Cayce. And then things started to really click about what was going on down there. That, in combination with these strange reports about people not being able to report things, made me wonder a great deal. And it brought us to where we are tonight. But one of the key players in all of this was a oceanographer and engineer named Paulina Zelitzky, whose story I was fascinated by and remain fascinated by, who was a Ukrainian engineer who was sent over to Cuba by the Soviet Union. And later she would escape and defect from Cuba and go to Canada. And she would start her own underwater anomaly, search service. They'd find treasures and things of this nature. So oddly enough, Fidel Castro, who features prominently in tonight's episode, had her come back. And this is in the late 90s. And he said, well, right around 1998, he said, I want you to come and we're going to be looking for things underwater. Now, she did find a very, very unusual structures in a whole metropolis, according to her, something absolutely fascinating and something which originally was covered pretty hardcore because they couldn't get around it because it was in Cuban media already. And so they tried to deal with it, and eventually they chipped away at the story and then submerged it, literally. So that gets us close to what's going on here in the HotZone tonight when we understand what was happening with Castro's search in the HotZone for these ancient ruins and our own search for those ancient ruins, which we get through a British agent who was retired and brought forward the most vast library of Atlantis. His name was Egerton Sykes. And according to him, that whole area of the HotZone is honeycombed with ruins relating to a very advanced culture, and that it's a gigantic geopolitical ping pong ball. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. So many of these things that we've seen on the surface relate directly to this clash underneath, but I'm going to bring forward some things tonight that have not been on the record ever, even in this series. And so it's going to be very exciting to share that with you tonight. And Paulina Zelitzky's work sits right in the center of it with her amazing discovery in the year 2000 of an Atlantis city metropolis under the water off the western tip of Cuba, which apparently people like T.T. Brown and others had been visiting and studying there in the past. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I want to remind you before we get started here to, especially if you're new, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's a free newsletter. and it keeps us in touch. We actually just switched providers on that, so it's an even better newsletter, smoother interface and everything else. And basically, it's free and it lets you know the incredible things that we have coming up for you, including documentaries, X series episodes that will blow your mind, interviews, off the charts, the things that are coming up this fall, and right in the middle of this heavy, heavy election season. And also just, kind of keeps you in touch with all the special events and things that we have coming up. So stand up and be counted, be on that newsletter list. Make sure you have that. We've been suffering through some incredible censorship, and it's only going to get worse with the things that they're pulling, because these are the types of discussions that we have here on this show and with the Ideas Room. And that's you, which basically these are exactly what they want to shut down. And so we have to make sure to keep that kind of fire going. The best way to do it is to have that direct pipeline through the newsletter. And so before I take off into tonight's escapades, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
This is interesting. 37 Mom says, we went to the JFK library and asked for the documents from Hemingway, but didn't realize that we need an appointment and reason why you want to review them.
Oh, yeah. Look, there's a gigantic crisscross unexplained in history between Hemingway and JFK. And what I've come to in the HotZone episodes is that JFK and Hemingway were part of this HotZone network, and that it formulated very early on in 1930s, and that people like Thomas Townsend Brown were a part of it, and that this intelligence operator in the UK, Egerton Sykes, he had heard of it. And if you really study his work, you're going to get a handle on that. What you'll find, actually, if you go into Egerton Sykes, we'll start off with Egerton Sykes, because before we're done tonight, you're going to have Santo Trafficante, Al Capone, Frank Sinatra, and the creme de la creme of the mafia world. But it's all going to be intertwined with this Atlantis research. It's going to make everything make a whole lot more sense. The Vatican is in tonight's episode. It's really Sam Giancana. I mean, this is one for the record books. It may take 2 parts to complete the whole cycle around this, but I did mention that we're doing this HotZone series, which is a 6-part series with a documentary crew, and we already have part 1 up there for you, and that is Hacking Atlantis. So make sure you check that out. I've made it a link in the description of this video. What else you got?
Kyle the White wants to know, what are the boundaries of the HotZone? And Cece says, maybe the HotZone search is why we invaded Cuba.
Yeah. Well, you're getting warm.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting warm in the HotZone. Yeah, what you'll find is the basic outlines of where the HotZone is as I stated, it's Bimini is part of it, the western tip of Cuba, and that part that connects visually to the Yucatan Peninsula. That whole area, then down into the Caribbean, constitutes the HotZone. But that also means off the coast of Florida, because when you get to Bimini, Andros, and all that, they're all so close. They're all in there. And that whole area constitutes it. And really, the Bermuda Triangle overlaps directly. So the 2 very powerful, unusual, unexplained areas. And I believe that one answers the other in terms of what was going on there. Of course, if we go directly to the Cayce readings on this, he talks about the Two-Eye Stone. We've done shows about the Two-Eye Stone, Tuaoi. This is something he would spell out in his readings over and over again when describing this power grid, massive power grid that the Atlanteans had, which was basically a gigantic crystal. And this crystal power grid system powered that civilization so that they had, in Cayce's words, flight. And if you really go into those readings, which, we're talking about the 1920s here, he's not only talking about that they had the ability of things like we can do now, but they also had dematerialization and things of this nature. That's really far out for back then. When you go 100 years fast forward in the future, and we're looking back on it, then Cayce's stuff, it makes a little more sense. Back then, it was pure science fiction. So as we go further and further into the future, we can see Cayce looking out through that kind of crystal ball that he had there, and he's seeing all these things come back into play that the Atlanteans had. And this is the theme in mystery school work, whether you're dealing with the anthroposophical work of Steiner or Blavatsky's work, there's a thread there that the Atlantean experience has all come back, and that we're sitting right in the heart of it now. And that what the original group of Atlanteans did when they got this knowledge and this mastery over the material plane was essentially blow themselves up. And they used the two eye stones to do it. And if you dig deep into the Cayce readings, when he talks about the two eye stone, he talks about how the power was reversed from what it was doing, and it was unintentionally set too high, so that it started to take down the land masses and set off volcanoes and all kinds of things. So he's getting into a very deep piece of all this. And when we get into areas that have unusual anomalies, like the Bermuda Triangle, how when you're in the hot zone, compasses spin backwards, that there are magnetic anomalies that are not, in the history books. There's no science recommendation or explanation for them. These are things which make the whole area very mysterious, and why a great deal of the NASA infrastructure operates directly around there, not to mention our own underwater Area 51 off of Andros Island. Gee, I wonder why they stationed it there. Well, you're going to find actually that a lot of the intelligence apparatus knows a great deal about Atlantis, and actually even infiltrated at certain times the Cayce Foundation to figure out more. So they're very aware of what we're talking about here. Those are the archaeological wars. So if we take that context, when we bring in these other things on the surface about the clashes that we hear, now there's a simplification going on. I call it counterfeit conspiracy. And it is the Netflix types and all this kind of thing picking up on so many of these independent media themes. And, people have worked on it over years and years. So what Netflix will do is they'll pick up the Danny Casolaro story, and they'll dress up this ridiculous thing and push it out there. And they'll have some elements of the main story, which is fascinating. We've put it out there. So many people have put it out there. Ken Thomas did books on it. They have the whole octopus theme. That was 20 years ago. Well, then you get somebody to just come along who's an author, dress up the subject, and give it to Netflix or whoever, and that's fine. But the problem is that they give a very watered down version of it. So this idea around potency when it comes to the independent media is absolutely crucial, which is why when we see those imitations of things, like the Lou Elizondo book on the UFO file that came out, and, an honest community, if the UFO community were honest, they would denounce that stuff as trash, which is what it is. It's a CIA operative, Lou Elizondo, operating in the space, being funded by people like Chris Mellon and others, and pushing forward a narrative for the Central Intelligence Agency about a false UFO threat. It's been exposed. And even people in their own camp, like Stratton and others now are saying, hey, the anecdotes in his book are stories I told him, So you have operatives there. They've already been discredited. So when you get the people who were supposed to be respectable in that UFO space, like Dolan, Knapp, or Nick Pope, I guess those people are respectable. And they are, raining sugar down on this ridiculous account by the CIA person. And he dedicates the book to James Clapper, special thanks to Clapper. This is the sick nature of that whole field. No wonder the deep state researchers stay away from the UFO thing. But I've always said that UFO research has a great advantage over deep state research that could really bring the deep state research up, which is it acknowledges the UFO file, which is what we do on this show, is bring them together. But I think the deep state researchers they understand how the government works, and they understand the whole thing about assassinations, overthrows, and misinformation, disinformation machines, and this whole thing. When they get around the UFO thing, they don't know what to believe, because you get a lot of this clown show. And the Elizondo thing is a good test case, because he's been discredited. He's come out and lied publicly. He said, I was the leader of this thing. And then later they were like, oh, it didn't exist. And then he was like, oh, well, it was an activity of mine. Just flat out lies. And there's so many that it's not even worth. I could sit here and just document his lies all night. So he's a lying counterintelligence agent sent into the field to spread, false disinformation about the UFO file and the UFO threat so they can develop a UFO office. This is very important for us. How does the independent media differ from the mainstream media? It's supposed to be about, the truth-telling aspect. And so when you have CIA people picking up elements of that independent research and just regurgitating them under this UFO CIA umbrella, what you do is you expose that and, moving on, right? But instead, these people who stake their careers on the UFO thing, what do? They embrace it and they say, oh, personal friend of mine, Lou Elizondo. Well, good, have him as a friend, but don't promote his phony work. Invite him to a barbecue if you want, but don't tell me that book is real because, I know it's fake. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight into the hot zone, and you're going to find us face to face with some organized crime characters, government operators, and the mystery around Atlantis. So we're bringing all three of those to you tonight. Before I jump in, Miss Olivia, this is your last chance.
Okay. So I will mention this. Carlton Percy says, with the Chinese taking over old Soviet bases in Cuba, the United States will probably never have access to any Atlantean sites off Cuba or Bimini.
Well, we have total access to Bimini and Andros. We control that whole thing. And in terms of Cuba, we have Guantanamo, of course. So we're in the game there. The problem is that we wanted to dominate the entire area. And if you go back just a little bit, like I was mentioning with the British intelligence agent, Egerton Sykes, he said, this is going back to the 1960s. He said, all these different forces are involved in the hot zone runs. He didn't mention the term hot zone. That's something we came up with here, but talking about this area. And he was referring directly to his Atlantis research, and he, had the most extensive Atlantis library, including international books that weren't translated into English. And this is somebody who put a great deal of things on the record and felt that, even the good communities like the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Cayce Foundation, as a foundation wasn't doing enough to take Cayce's readings really to their logical conclusion. And a lot of that had to do with doing archaeological research in the United States and in the Bahamas. And so, you don't know how organizations work. And I think in general, the ARE is regarded as really great people. But I think as an organization, it's afraid of Cayce's very edgy work in relation to Atlantis. And when you get into that, you have to really say that Cayce was giving us this unexpurgated version of the thing. And so I feel that since his readings didn't edit anything out, that these organizations shouldn't be like, oh, we don't want to deal with that. But certainly reincarnation plays into this, as well as the materialization of humanity, the incredible advances that they had in Atlantis, the Two-Eye Stone Network, and the advanced technology, the interaction with interdimensionals, the tapping into the outer spheres or the saintly realm. All those things are in there in the Cayce work. And the way he describes it is basically a worldwide civilization that was incredibly advanced on the technological end. Not some ancient aliens, flim-flam, this is the real thing. He's talking about a culture of humanity that developed in this fashion. And, sure, they may have had interactions with off-world visitors. It's quite possible. But this was the advancement in the very unusual nature of these Atlanteans, which forms the foundation of so much of this episode here in the Hot Zone. I'm going to read a couple of things about Sykes, Egerton Sykes, and it's going to set us up for understanding what's going on there geopolitically in the Hot Zone. So that by the time we get into the Cuban Revolution, by the time we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis, and by the time we get into the collapse of the Soviet Union, we understand these things from a very different point of view. So Sykes is quite fascinating. I've tried to do him justice, but he was always somebody who sort of hung out in the background. He edited books. He put together libraries. He wrote articles. He put a journal regular monthly Atlantis journal out. Absolutely fascinating research. But Sykes did something very important. And, he's 4 decades of British intelligence. So he was very, very deep in the heart of all this. But he was like, I can't believe that this whole thing about Atlantis is not being acknowledged. It's absolutely ridiculous. And you're going to find that all these different intelligence agencies and these different countries are battling over those ruins that are underwater in the Atlantic. A few of the points that he brought across, I'm going to read them here. And this is very important because Cuba's always in the heart of the research that he does. In 1951, the Cuba Institute of Archaeology debated the possibility that Cuba was once in some way related to Atlantis. By the way, Cuban archaeology in the 50s is incredibly advanced. They deal with Atlantis. They deal with the whole astronomical petroglyph combination, archaeoastronomy and things before anything is like that is happening in America. So Cuba, for some reason, was off the ground on this. They concluded that the island's prehistoric caves with petroglyphs and astronomical symbols and a staircase leading to a rudimentary observatory in Punta del Este may support that theory. The unique calendrical system of the inhabitants of Tiwanaku, immortalized in a great stone gateway, and idols accurately fit in with the lunar capture theory as described by German scientist Edmund Kiss after his visit to Tiwanaku. Now, Egerton Sykes' interests in the archaeology of the Caribbean began with Horace Guevara's underwater find of stone columns off the coast of Bermuda in 1958. It's actually not true because he was corresponding with Cayce in the 1930s. So, but nonetheless, this is interesting. The discovery of a sunken temple off the island of Andros by Manson Valentine and Dmitry Rybakov, a Fort Lauderdale oceanographer and underwater explorer. Valentine later discovered more underwater remains off of North Bimini, of course, the famous Bimini Wall. In 1965, an Italian expert on North Africa published The Early Inhabitants of the Canary Islands, in which he considered the original inhabitants of the Canary Islands may have been of Berber origin, and the Berbers, original inhabitants of Northwest Africa, were descendants of the Atlanteans. So you have this kind of thing that Sykes is tapping into in relation to Cuba being a doorway to some of these ancient ruins. Later, if you go into the work, you're going to see that he actually identifies that there are things that resemble like the Temple of Isis from Egypt, for example, down there in the Bahamas. And he never gave the actual location of it, but he said a number of different groups are aware of this thing. It's very difficult to access, but they know that it's there. And that they're also studying a whole chain of different things that completely rewrite history. Now, enter Paulina Zelitzky. Zelitsky, as I mentioned, the oceanographer, the engineer, who was originally from Ukraine and under the control of the Soviet Union. That the KGB, I think, actually had someone following her when she was doing the scientific work in Cuba. And she did eventually defect, as I mentioned, to Canada. And eventually she started her own underwater search company, which could assist companies in finding minerals and all kinds of other things. But when she was in Cuba, interestingly enough, before when she got called back there by Castro to do this very deep dive into what he said, oh, I'm looking for Spanish galleons. And I put this together before, which is Spanish galleons is a code for anything having to do with something underwater. So if you're looking for the ruins off the HotZone, all you have to do is say, hey, Spanish galleons. There's so many different Spanish wrecks that had gold. It's an easy enough thing to do. And countries and individual treasure hunters do find those things and look for them for sure. But in this case, what Castro was looking for, there's a very interesting sign about how he discovered it very early on in the 1950s, that there was a gigantic city off the coast, the western tip of Cuba, and we'll get into that. But before she found those cities, there's a very interesting picture of her in those caves with the 20,000-year-old markings of some kind of astronomical disaster that took place. And somebody back there was trying to catalog this thing, saying something big is coming in, and giving that really hardcore analysis. And it's left there, and it's an echo of time. And yet it gives us an age of very sophisticated groups in Cuba operating at a very, very early stage. What happened with her and her work is quite fascinating. Before we get to that, I want to show you a little bit more of the caves there, because some of the petroglyphs and things are very advanced. By the way, these were discovered in 1922, and they were completely anomalous. Very advanced Spanish archaeologists went in there. This is more of that cave system and some of the things that they found in there. And of course, there's steganography right in the heart of it. It's hard to miss.
Psychedelic.
It is a little bit more. This is actually directly out of his notebook, which I find interesting. But we get some idea there that these people, going back in time, that Cuba has a rich history here with some of these symbols and astronomical knowledge. One of the things that I found in relation to this that I've put forward that I think represents the Two Eyes Stone was found in Florida. And that is that incredible Bloomfield Moore discovery of these copper plates. And that system that's represented there, again, you can see that spiral like the caves, but I think that the various power centers are being represented there directly. Now, what happens with Zelitsky, and I put part of this in the documentary, but she has a very interesting journey with this, because she starts to find all these incredible things after Castro has her go down there. She's sending deep sea submersibles, and she's saying, well, I'm not just finding a temple. It's not just that I found one pyramid or whatever. I'm finding a metropolis. This is a whole city worth of stuff. And she starts to take sonograms and different things. And she's going with sonar, trying to find the actual nature of this entire structure and its dimensions. And then with the deep sea submersibles, she starts to see other things, like there are hieroglyphs on this. And she does a series of interviews. Even National Geographic and other people get a hold of her. And what happens with her is very strange, because the story goes off all of these front pages, because it got out originally, remember, in media that wasn't so controlled. It was coming out through stories in Cuba already. And I believe that Castro was in the know about this and decided this was the time to move forward. And I think that, Castro, and we're going to get into him and his psychology and his revolution tonight, but his whole purpose in his own mind, you could see, was to be a man of history and to make great changes and all the rest. Now, he is also, a very brutal dictator. There's no whitewashing the things that Castro did. And I love to see some of these fluffy things that are written about him at times. But he is no question. He's absolutely consequential. And his knowledge base is great. And he shows up at this pivot point in time where you have the forces in the deep state struggling to overwhelm our own leadership structure here. And he's right in the heart of that. And they also think about, how can we use him as kind of a fall guy for the things they want to do with the Central Intelligence Agency and others in the 1963 assault on the presidency. Now, it's very interesting because he also seems to have a sense of destiny along with all this. So that goes with part of why I think he brings this forward. And I'm going to reveal something else here tonight, which is that he unveils in the year 2000, the same year that he's bringing forward these incredible discoveries through Paulina Zelitzky, a statue of John Lennon in a park in Cuba. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons. One, that the Beatles were actually banned. Their music was banned, All You Need Is Love and all the rest. It's banned in Cuba. So for most of the, for 50 years of the revolution. And nonetheless, underground people trade records and things. So the Beatles are actually very popular there anyway. But what's fascinating is suddenly, you know, our friend Castro is coming out of the blue and putting the limelight on John Lennon. There's a few interesting things about that. One of them is that Castro had a huge aversion to statues and wouldn't allow statues to be made of himself, thinking it was a bourgeois thing to do, and the revolution wouldn't be associated with that. You know, they put up big posters of himself and Che Guevara and, and others. So he didn't mind the glorification, but this thing about statues, no way. Well, here he is unveiling that John Lennon statue. And a lot of people wondered at the time, if you read the articles, what was he doing? You know, he's a secret fan of John Lennon. This is very unusual. Now, oddly enough, John Lennon, of course, if you've watched the HotZone episodes, goes deep, deep trying to solve the mystery of Atlantis and sleeps at night with Edgar Cayce on Atlantis by his bedside. So this is somebody who's absolutely obsessed with it and bought lots in the Atlantic Ocean with the idea that land was rising, which is a key tenet if you go inside the mystery schools, that we're in a period of land rising. And a lot of the people who got very into this in the 60s and 70s were just a little bit off time-wise. You know, this is something that was going to happen more in the period of that we're in, for example. And this is something you never hear anything about, and yet it is happening. But the idea that if a landmass comes up somewhere in international waters, it is a wide open country to be claimed. And so some people were in the know about this, and they would pick out different areas of international waters and they would buy them. One of those people was the brother of Ernest Hemingway. And this gets us into very deep territory. And it's going to explode when we get into comparing all these different people who are finding things and realize that there's something going on in the HotZone related directly to Atlantis. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Wise Guys in the HotZone. And trust me, we're going to get to the Wise Guys. That's going to be the fun part of the show. This is the Castro Atlantis mystery, going deep here in Cuba in this case. Of course, we're going to be taking your questions later tonight as well. And we'll go a couple with hours with you here tonight. As I mentioned, you can ask those questions. Miss Olivia puts them all together. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Bob says, I made note when the recent Russian Navy task force was in the HotZone, it included a sub and a deep water recovery tug.
Yeah, there's a good reason for that.
And the other one is Thermobsterful says China has a base on Andros.
Yes. Well, they're in there in different islands. Autech actually has the base on Andros. So I don't know if China's on Andros, but they do have bases there, which is insane if you think about it. And they also have a presence in Cuba. But this thing about the Russians, you know, bringing their nuke submarines right around Miami as kind of a warning, etc., harkens directly back to the original problem that we had with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was President Kennedy's leadership that kept us out of a nuclear war. But what's fascinating about all this is the conditions themselves. Because if you really go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the things that led up to it, a lot of the conditions that crept in there don't make sense. And I'll explain it to you this way. But when we get to Castro, although he's leading a revolution and all the rest of it, he's not going to be successful without our help originally. This is the kind of left out part in all of these histories, that we're assisting him. And I actually go into the different players around the Castro regime, like Frank Sturgis, who shows up later as a Watergate burglar, and who worked closely with E. Howard Hunt, and therefore the JFK, you know, the whole realm of the JFK assassination instantly shows up in this story. There's no way of getting around it. What's fascinating is when you go into some of those stories and you see what Sturgis is saying, he's working for Castro. Remember, he's a close buddy of Castro's, and he is Castro's right-hand man. And it is him, you know, he's the one who's getting recruited by the CIA to spy on Castro. But he becomes aware, are already helping Castro in a number of different ways. In fact, when he is jailed originally under the Batista regime, there's no explanation for how he gets out in the first place. That's odd. Then he goes to Mexico, and guess what? He's hanging out in the US for a couple of years. Interesting guy. By the time he goes back into Cuba and is leading this rebel force and all the rest of it, he has this tremendous force behind him. And there's a lot of different explanations for it, sure. But for my money, we're not going to let go of our cash cow in Cuba that way. So we assisted with it. And somehow during the rise of this thing that we were supporting, somehow it turned on us. And for me, it seems to me that they already knew that. And so there's some element that's forcing this clash that happens. Even the Soviets putting the missiles into Cuba is quite unusual. And I think, again, it represents these dynamics that when you get around the hot zone, there's something there that somebody wants complete dominance over the area for. Now, I've put it into these ruins, and there's a reason I do that. But I want to mention something else. If you go into the Cayce readings in relation to Bimini, he says, if you go under the structure, there's volcanoes there. And if you really tap into that Bimini piece, you're going to find more gold circulating than anywhere in the circulation of the earth. Well, would you think the most massive gold mine on earth would be something to fight over? There's no question about that, but you don't hear anything about that. Somebody knows about it, or was Cayce just wrong? I don't think so. And this is why we get into intrigues which aren't in the history books, but there are trails. There are definitive trails that we can find, and these kinds of steganography facts, as I call them. That trail of breadcrumbs will lead us to a very interesting place. We're going to understand things from a whole different level. Yes, what do you got?
Joseph Tuca says maybe Cuba is allowed to be a communist slum because development of the island would disturb Atlantean artifacts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually, I think that they've been working in the background. Groups have been working on those ruins since at least 1926, ruins that are predominantly underwater. What I'm going to kind of reveal tonight is that Paulina Zelitzky may have given us the entire key to this. Now, I've corresponded with Paulina, by the way, and one of the conditions that she had for me, if she was going to do an interview with me, and she has considered it off and on, was that I read her 2-volume autobiography series. And it is a fascinating story, but it doesn't include the big piece about the Cuba ruins. So I was very interested in that. She is incredibly smart and also went through an incredible trauma with all this. And I want to give you some details on that. One of the things that happened with Paulina Zelitzky, who found the incredible ruins off the western tip of Cuba, after a while of her doing this work for Castro, they started to boss her around in a fashion and kind of bully the process. And what was going on ultimately, when I drilled this down, I said, who got you out of there? Because it was always my impression that it was the United States that was trying to control the hot zone that would have, threatened her to get out of there. She said it was the Cuban Navy. Now, they had hired her, and here they are pushing her out. By the time she goes to Mexico on her way back to Canada, they put her in a prison in Mexico. How terrifying is that for someone who's doing this deep sea research? And they had some phony thing about, some company or some ridiculous thing about, there's some private information of some company underwater. And so they try to spook her, and basically they say to her, we're going to let you go, but don't come back. And so she goes back to Canada, and the story is lingering there in the air, and she gives interviews on it and all the rest still, but ultimately it's sort of a hands-off thing. So here I showed up, sometime around 2015, 2016, talking to her about the hot zone, maybe more like 2017 actually. And I can sense her reluctance even to get into the whole subject again. And yet you can tell, this is somebody who found probably one of the greatest discoveries archaeologically, period, in my opinion. But she, archaeology dropped the ball on the story. The mainstream media got rid of the story. The National Geographic types were just like, oh, forget about that, get that into the past. They don't want the story out there. And at first, they thought they could shape and mold the story. But what was interesting to me is that archaeologists who work even with the Atlantis theme didn't do their research when it came to Paulina Zelitzky. And I did my homework on the things that she discovered, and it is an incredible, incredible discovery. Now, a couple of things about this. And tonight I'm going to reveal that she, in the form of allegorical material, has put out something that's going to give us a gigantic key to one, why she left, two, what she discovered, and three, what Castro was up to, including the crisscross with the Vatican on these Atlantean ruins. Tonight, it's going to get very, very hot here in the Hot Zone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Wise guys in the Hot Zone. Oh, yeah, they're here too. Castro Atlantis mystery, taking us deep into this antediluvian past and our checkered geopolitical history. We're taking your questions here in the second part of the show as well. Okay, so Castro, as I mentioned, these ruins, he reveals the statue of John Lennon. John Lennon is deep into the Hot Zone ruins, studying the whole piece. Now, it is Cayce's readings where we get this whole arc of Atlantean knowledge from. And Cayce is telling us in the 1920s that off the coast of Bimini, there will be, as land is rising, there will be the reveal of these Atlantean temples. And it is the Temple of Poseidia. And Poseidia are the Amelius group, who again are using that advanced 2-eye technology to do what? They're trying to connect with higher spiritual realms. They're preparing people, preparing priestesses to interact with the saintly realms through that 2-eye technology. So they're not so much thinking of conquering nature with it, but there's a group with them in Atlantis, and that Belial group is operating the technology for a world dominance capability. They do have it out at a certain point. And it's interesting because, the sons of Belial basically win, but they destroy everything in winning. And the Amelius group runs around all over the world depositing these halls of records so that we'll have some understanding of this when the consciousness reemerges again. This is the period that we're in, according to Cayce. It's quite fascinating. I'm going to tell you a very weird anomaly. And, when you get into the X series research, these things happen. One of them was when I got the CIA report on from 1964 of them placing individuals inside the ARE to spy on what the Hall of Records was. But if you go into the archaeological war piece that we do on this show, we're going to find that the CIA has spent all kinds of money investigating, for example, Noah's Ark and other deep mysteries. So they're very aware of the power of these things. So the archaeological wars that were revealed through the Baghdad Museum looting that was taking place while the American soldiers were sitting on the sidelines doing absolutely nothing didn't make sense if you just look at that in a straight up basis. They make a lot more sense now that there was something in those Baghdad museums that they wanted to look at. So Cayce, when he's putting together the ARE, it's quite fascinating because he puts together this incredible hospital building. And in 1932, he's there building these things. And it does eventually become the headquarters for the Association for Research and Enlightenment there in Virginia Beach. Now, here's the X twist. You ready? So one of the key players in the Cuban Revolution is our friend, Frank Sturgis. And Sturgis, whose real name is Fiorini, but his name magically gets changed. And there's an odd crisscross because as someone who spends so much time in Cuba assisting the revolution, and then after assisting Castro getting into power, is tapped by the CIA to help assassinate him, he's right in the heart of that story. He's in the heart of the Watergate story. He's in the heart of a few stories you haven't heard that I'm going to bring up tonight. But here's one. He owned the Top Hat nightclub, which was, well, it was literally only 5 or 10 minutes away from the ARE. So this is an oddness because part of that idea of sending people to study the ARE and the information on the Cayce work is already exceptional that we have that on record from the CIA. But the mere fact of placement, and this is something that Mae Brussel was very good at giving us, that when you put somebody here and you put somebody here, it's not guilt by association, but their proximity to something gives them a relationship to it potentially. And the idea of Frank Sturgis working very close to the Cayce Foundation is fascinating from a research point of view, because then he spends all this time down there in the hot zone commandeering this revolution and being used by the CIA and other people. But here we have that crisscross that again shows up, and it shows up with one of his great partners, which is E. Howard Hunt, who was in charge of so many of the CIA operations in Cuba. And what was the book that was his go-to fiction book that was really one of the some 50 odd books that E. Howard Hunt would write? Well, he writes a fictional book in 1949, and it is called Bimini Run. Bimini Run, this is pretty interesting. It's one of those pulp novels in the swashbuckling hero who does all these different things in the hot zone. His name is Sturgis. So some people have studied Sturgis' life and then studied the book and said, oh, he got this directly from Sturgis. And yet the idea generally is that, Sturgis didn't meet Hunt until the early 1970s in the Nixon White House as to be part of this plumber unit to go around collecting intelligence through legal means. But that book came out in 1949, and the hero is Hank Sturgis. So if you do a little research on Sturgis and how his name was originally Fiorini and how it came to be Sturgis, his mother remarried someone named Sturgis in 1939, 10 years before this book. So he's, Hunt using the name Sturgis makes sense directly because legally this is his name for 10 years. He would have known him directly as Sturgis. And here he is just planting him right in the middle of his book. But the Bimini part is also quite fascinating because, of course, Bimini is directly where Cayce is putting the emphasis along the lines of the Poseidon temples. So we're getting into a crisscross here again around the geopolitics of the hot zone. But on record in his own testimony before congressional committees and in legal cases, Sturgis talks directly about working right there in Virginia Beach and owning, not only running, but owning this Top Cat nightclub right there. For me, that was too big of an anomaly to leave hanging out there. We're going to get into why in just a minute. Now, and keep in mind our friend Castro putting together this John Lennon statue. That's going to come in handy later. Who's that with Fidel Castro? That's Frank Sturgis. Sturgis is his right.
It's a very intimate posture.
It is. That shows that they're pals for sure. And I think one of the fascinating things about this picture is the kind of friendship trust level exchange. And over again, if you go through the different stories about Castro and the revolution, Sturgis is right there. He's the person that Castro relies on over and over again to help with the training, to help with all these various things. Sturgis, if you check out what our friend, the Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, says about him, he gives him an accommodation at the end of World War II, and he says, "This guy is like one of the bravest of the soldiers that we had. He did all these things in the Pacific Theater, just one of the best guerrilla fighters. So when he's going in there, he's such an incredible asset for our friend Castro." And what happens is, at a certain point, of course, Castro's true colors start to emerge, the very deep communism, etc. That socialist Marxist streak that turns into a large scale communism with him. But what's weird, if you go a little bit deeper on that, is that it looks like all those signs were originally there. So, in my opinion, although Sturgis' account is different, it seems to me that somebody is placing him directly next to Castro for the purposes of being a double or triple agent there anyway. So even though he claims, yeah, at a certain point I was doing all this stuff for Castro, and then the CIA approached me and I realized that Castro was a bad guy working against us, and then I turned against him. No, I think he's put in there directly in the beginning. And even in some of his own accounts, it's quite fascinating, because when he's talking about Castro, he's saying, it seems to me that some of the CIA people who are promoting him, they're helping him with this. So the CIA very early on is helping Castro. And what is Castro's big goal? Is to get rid of the Batista regime. Well, Batista, it's very interesting, because although he rises to power in 1933 in Cuba, he's very young at that period. And there's a lot of unusual connections that Batista has, but when they go through a reorganization around 1940 in Cuba, he's the president. He takes one term and then he gets out. So he doesn't come back until 1952. So there's this idea of him just being there this whole time, but he's not. He comes into great prominence in the 30s, then he becomes president, then he gets out. That is interesting as well. But also the fact that the Cubans join in on our side during World War II, that's very important. And we have characters like Ernest Hemingway ping-ponging between Bimini and Cuba. One of the things that I've made kind of a great emphasis on in relation to Ernest Hemingway is that he's spending all this time staring at the ocean floor with this boat back and forth. And the boat that he has set up is set up with heavy-duty scientific equipment. And when they ask him what he's doing, he says, well, obviously, I'm looking for German U-boats. The whole thing was absurd. He had no official position to do that one. The boat is scientifically equipped, so it doesn't have guns and things. If you find a U-boat, what are you going to do? The U-boat's going to blow you out of the water. So none of those explanations ever made any sense. When I dug into Hemingway's brother's past, I found, as part of his news correspondence as a young journalist, he's in a submarine going back and forth right around the hot zone. And he's in Cuba in a submarine. And I have no doubt, it's acknowledged that he said in the 1950s, while flying in, that he sees a huge city off the western coast of Cuba. I have no doubt that he saw this stuff up close in his submarine. This is where, the whole Hemingway Cayce crisscross goes on. And I've pointed out the closeness of those two families, including the fact that the mother's getting readings directly from Cayce about Ernest. And, the fact that members of the Cayce family are going to visit the Hemingways. Where do they go? Do they go for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days? They go for a month. I'll be back in a month. That's a close relationship. So the things that Cayce is giving about Atlantis and all the rest, all of a sudden, Hemingway, with his incredible life as a novelist, he's showing up. Where's he living all the time? He's in Bimini. He's in Key West. He's in Cuba. He's right in the heart of the hot zone. And he's doing what? Well, he's living this incredible life and all the rest of it. But the double life part is that he's there and he's part of this hot zone network. And that's part of what we put on the record. And his relationship to Castro when he comes in is quite fascinating as well. And we're going to get into that in a minute. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Wise guys in the hot zone. Castro Atlantis mystery, going deep here tonight. And one of the figures there, Frank Sturgis, instantly showing up in an unusual light, working close to the Cayce Foundation. We're going to find out why that's important here in a minute. Before we go any further, I want to say, if you're new here, to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through this remarkable censorship that we're looking at. And we do have this new email server, so it's an even more streamlined process. But basically, once a week, you'll get these incredible details about the shows we have coming up for you, remarkable X-series shows, documentaries, the best interviews, and events that are coming up. And if you want to stand up and be counted and hear about it first, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. Literally just punch your email in and you're gold. It'll all show up in your inbox. So make sure you do that. Before we go any further tonight, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Catherine Harris says RFK Jr. visited Castro at his home in Cuba when Castro was elderly. Robert discussed this in a recent interview.
Isn't that fascinating? Yes, he did. And there are some interesting things there because it's in my Twitter feed. I didn't print it out for tonight, but there are pictures of him diving off the western coast of Bimini. And that's in 2010, I believe. And I also have photos of him off the Bimini Wall, diving off the Bimini Wall. So, Bobby is just the kind of guy who's tuned in to this, and I have no doubt about it. I think that there was some desire on the part of Bobby's mother where she went down in the 1990s and visited Castro, and there was some desire for closure there about her saying, I don't blame you for what happened, and I don't believe the CIA that you were involved in the Kennedy assassinations. But the other piece of this, which is fascinating, I'm going to bring to light a meeting that John F. Kennedy Jr. had with Castro in 1997 that I believe relates directly to information about the JFK assassination, but may also relate to these HotZone ruins. The story was supposed to bring, JFK was supposed to bring forward this incredible interview with our friend Castro. All these things were going to come out of it. And he went there. There are pictures of the meeting. They had a 5-hour meeting. And it became a very hush-hush thing. So something unusual.
It just got buried.
It did. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because I have the story right here. And I'm going to put it in out of sequence here because it came up. But this is the New York Times article, and we get the date on it, October 25th, 1997. John F. Kennedy Jr., one step ahead of the pack, quietly travels to Cuba. John F. Kennedy Jr., the editor of George magazine, has quietly traveled to Cuba on the 35th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which his father, the president, faced down the Soviet premier Nikita Khruschev in a nuclear confrontation. But the purpose of his visit was a mystery yesterday. He's there as a journalist, Nancy Haberman, a spokesman for George magazine, said, insisting she had no other details. Others close to Mr. Kennedy, including his cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., declined to talk about the visit or its significance. United States and Cuban officials also said they had no information. It was unclear whether Mr. Kennedy went on his own or at the behest of Cuba's government, whether an interview with President Fidel Castro had been arranged, or even if the trip was intended to provide a scoop for George. And then they go into this whole thing about John F. Kennedy in 1962. That is one of the pictures of the meeting, and you can see there's a kind of a tension there with Kennedy sitting across the table from Castro. Something major is going on in all that, and it's interesting to look at and just figure out what exactly was happening. But for me, there's another picture of the meeting, and it's not the kind of like, hi, I'm here, all smiles, it's great to meet you kind of thing. Something serious is being exchanged. And for all we know, it was positive, but whatever it was went completely black as soon as he came back. No one talked about it. No one in his family talked about it. Castro didn't talk about it. That was the end. So let's just say that hangs out there as an outlier. It's one of those things which, when we get to John F. Kennedy Jr., we know he was digging a lot into his father's murder, and he was doing it quietly behind the scenes. But also, this whole revelation about the hot zone comes into play because we will find out that the Vatican becomes an aspect of this hot zone story of the Cuban ruins, and that Paulina Zelitzky, the engineer who found, after all, the Cuban city off the western tip of Cuba, she will later come out, most recently, within the past 2 years, with an allegory through the form of a dog. And the dog tells a story about something remarkable discovered in Cuba. And we're going to read directly from what she was getting into. Before I go there, though, a little more of Hemingway in the hot zone, and I think it needs to be pointed out. Again, we're dealing with the close relationship of the Hemingways with the Cayces. And Cayce, early on, there are stories about him starting to slip through the remarkable readings that he gave and all the rest. And it attracts the attention of Hemingway's mother. And she becomes not only just someone who gets readings, but someone who's a real student of the Cayce work. But she has this son she has a difficult relationship with, and she tries to get readings for how to guide him. And one of the things that Cayce gives us is that Hemingway was someone who, when he was in Egypt, he had a kind of a magical personality and, something along the lines of having this mind control ability or a kind of charisma there. And that, some of it was good and some of it didn't do him so well. But in this life, Hemingway, of course, is an extraordinary story, and his books are some of the most legendary. However, what's off the record are two major pieces. One, his relationship to John Kennedy, which is why, and we've outlined this before, all the material ends up of Hemingway's at the John F. Kennedy Library. And two, the Atlantis hot zone research, which we've pieced together directly through this correlation of Cayce and Hemingway. Now, a step further, of course, is Hemingway's brother, and that is Les Hemingway.
He's so jolly.
He's
I love him.
pointing out Atlantis on the map. That's where he thinks it is. And he goes to such a point where he actually declares New Atlantis. He buys one of those lots out there in the ocean, and he creates his own nation there. And at a certain point, the government says, stop that. You're not going to do that. And he hangs in there for a while. And then a hurricane comes in and blows out whatever he set up there. And it becomes one of these odd memories of New Atlantis. And he joins this remarkable club along with John Lennon and others of people who were convinced that Atlantis was rising. And this comes directly, as I said, out of the mystery school teachings. And we're going to find out why that is so left off the picture. One of the things we can say about Castro is that he was a great admirer of Hemingway's and said that by reading his books, he actually figured out how to do the revolution that he did. That's quite a compliment. But Hemingway had no desire to live under the kind of conditions that were going on once Castro took over. This is interesting because one of the things that Castro was riding in on was the fact that Batista had become repressive with all people kind of turning against him, and that he had, for traitors, they had firing squads and things of this nature under Batista. And then what happens immediately with Castro when he gets in is he's coming in under this thing of like, hey, I'm a whole different type of regime. And then what does he do? Oh, firing squads are the order of the day. This guy's an enemy, that guy's an enemy. And so you're getting kind of, the Saddam Hussein treatment there with Castro, although he masks it in this idealism about a social framework of socialism there in Cuba. Now, both he and his revolutionary friend, Che Guevara, and they are remarkable figures of history, but they come out of this bourgeois world. There's one picture I was looking at with Che Guevara and Castro, and I was thinking, there's the lawyer and there's the doctor. I mean, these guys were in the creme de la creme of the society. And, they become this kind of proletarian champions. And yet, you have to wonder, in a sense, how much of that is just a rebellion against their own class and all the rest of it. And aren't they kind of reinventing, by elevating themselves as leaders, a different type of bourgeois quality? But nonetheless, they are, ultimately archetypal characters. What's interesting is Castro, when he gets into power, he seems to get too much power at a certain point, and he starts demanding that the Soviet Union adopt a first strike capability against the United States. So, Castro's not very old. He's in his mid-30s when he takes over, and he doesn't have really the chops, but he has a remarkable success there. But he's rash, impulsive, and he attracts a lot of people with the whole angry routine. But here he is, and why the Kennedy administration considers him such a danger is that he's using this rhetoric about nuclear confrontation. And so it's in the back of his head. He realizes, in my opinion now, that what happened was he took a hand up from the CIA to get in. That needs to be more clear in the record books. It's really not. They make it very loose, but really the CIA put him in. We just have to be real about that. And I think it's easily provable. But next, it's clear that something happens there, and their relationship deteriorates quickly. It's also funny because, the common story is that Castro gets in, he throws the mafia out, he gets rid of the casinos, and gives the money to the people and that whole thing. Doesn't happen that way. What he does, interestingly enough, is he says, the way that the mafia were running the gambling halls, it was all fixed. And I want people to come in and run the casinos, and I want them to be run fairly. So he runs, and, for the first few months of the revolution, all the casinos and all that stuff, the infrastructure is in place. But Batista has taken off out the back door. And what's interesting, he'll end up in Spain. And the price tag on Batista getting out of there and what he amassed is supposedly $700 million back then. So we're talking about $5 to $10 billion, to be this puppet of the US there and allow all these things to happen. But we have genuine interests in Cuba that have been building up for a long time. And so do the Kennedys, by the way, have interests, heavy-duty interests, and a history with Cuba before all this stuff. Many people are not aware, and it is kind of left out of the history of John Kennedy, that he spent time in Havana, Cuba in the 50s. And that's interesting, too. He was a world traveler, and he wanted to know about every place. He spent time in the Soviet Union, and I found him studying ancient ruins in Peru in 1940. So some of the backgrounds, I think when they're doing histories in relation to Kennedy, they're like, he's up against this revolutionary and all the rest of it. And yet, if you go into the Kennedy family, you're going to find that, for example, RFK Jr.'s grandfather, Skakel, had a major real estate venture in Cuba, and his house was right next door to Batista's. That was an interesting little tidbit. Yeah. So the histories on this are interesting. When you get to who's battling it out here and why, it gets quite fascinating. If you go back a couple of decades from the Kennedy period, you're going to find Al Capone using Cuba as a major station for bootlegging. And then you're going to find the major distribution network of Joe Kennedy is right in the middle of all that. And eventually it becomes this company called Somerset, which does legal distribution of alcohol all over the world, and makes the Kennedys incredibly rich. But in the beginning, there's a 10-year prohibition law, or it's even longer, actually. I think it's from 1919 to 1932 when FDR gets in and he lifts it. That might be 33, the actual year. But this gets us into interesting territory because there's a whole infrastructure built up there. And I compare it to what they did with the lottery because, for example, many of the lotteries that we hear about now, Powerball and Mega Millions, all that stuff, didn't exist. The mafia ran it. And so they had these pools, and that's what they had bookies for and all the rest of it. So illegal gambling was gigantic. And then what happened? All these states adopted their own lotteries and it became a network. And then the United States, you got Powerball, I think in the 1970s. But before that, that's how the mafia thing was running wild because people wanted to gamble, just like they're legalizing marijuana now. Well, before it was a gigantic infrastructure of these drug dealers, but still the hands of business are moving and massaging these things before they're legal and before they have a label name on them. So when people go into these pot shops now and they find these different versions of marijuana, well, your local drug dealer, is getting serviced by the same people. It just they didn't have a brand label yet. And the government oversees all that and takes their cut. And that's what's so important, I think, about Cuba when we're thinking of it this way, which is to understand that they were part of a pie that was going on. The thing is, and what's unusual about Cuba and why I think the hot zone aspect gets in there, is Cuba as fascinating as it is, and it is beautiful, and the people are remarkable. But for it to play its role as dramatically as it did in the early half of the 20th century is unusual to me because there are many other options, shall we say, there. So why Cuba becomes such the hotspot and such the focus of all this attention and all this money and all this mafia and all this CIA and all this revolution and all the rest of it. We can look at other islands there that you would think would be even better candidates for some of this. So there's something unique, and we're going to get to it in the middle of all this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, Wise Guys in the Hot Zone. Yes, we're going to look at some of the wise guys. And, I think the Kennedys are remarkable when we look at all this because there's such an idealism that comes through with John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. But part of it is a reaction against their dad. And we have to remember that as well, because although he carried a certain type of idealism, he had to fight in those piranha infested waters of business and politics early on. And so he sort of fought a lot of the sharks along the way. And so he already had kind of this double life of idealism mixed with corruption. And those are the waters he was swimming in, and it was unavoidable. But I think that Kennedy, there's a few key things that we learn about him. One is that he was absolutely a genius at business. And he was the youngest bank president in history at 24 years old. But two, he always was in the right place at the right time, including during the incredible market surge of the 1920s. That's where he makes an incredible amount of his money. But there's also this liquor business. And it's interesting because there are some historians that have said, well, we're not sure if it was bootlegging because bootlegging actually consisted of drinking it. So, but obviously transporting it was illegal as well. It's very interesting the way that plays, but I don't think it is such a knock against Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, to say that he was a bootlegger because the government did a ridiculous thing there and they created a black market. And so anyone who was smart about business would get in on that kind of market and do it and had the opportunity to do it. So I don't think that works against him. He was just a businessman, and that works when he goes into Hollywood as well. But I think that he had a sense of needing to fit in because Irish Catholics were so put upon. And his father had taught him as an Irish Catholic politician and somebody who had similar types of ambitions, so wasn't quite as good at it. But he had taught him, look, they won't accept us. You're going to have to be better than everybody else. And so that's where he gets this incredibly remarkable competitive streak. And by the way, he was planning on being president himself. And when FDR makes him the ambassador to the UK, he makes some comments during the rise of Hitler. And what happens is the comments are taken as, "Oh, you're soft on fascism." And it ruins his political aspirations completely. He was planning when FDR got out to be the president, and he transfers that ambition to his sons. And he actually thinks that Joe here, who was a very interesting figure, older brother of John F. Kennedy, he's putting all his aspirations in him. Jack shows no interest at all in politics, and he's interested in journalism, and he also has a lot of health problems. So Joe, in fact, is putting most of his emphasis on Joe Jr. And one of the things you'll read in that history, and of course, Joe Jr. dies in a plane crash in 1944 doing a secret mission, flying all these armaments and over the English Channel. And what you'll find is, this is how competitive the Kennedys are, that Joe had heard, and had gone through this thing with his brother, surviving this attack on this PT-109 boat and saving his men and bringing them to an island, and the whole dramatic hero story that he has. And that's a remarkable experience for JFK, but the brother felt the need to compete with it, which is why he took the mission. So this was a weird thing that haunted Jack later in his life. But I think that what happens is, Kennedy, on his way to ascending the ladder, he knows the forces that his dad has had to swim with. And one of the famous quotes of Robert Kennedy in talking to John Kennedy is, he says, it's supposed to be the sins of the father are visited upon the sons for 7 years. He goes, how many years are you going to have to live off his sins? So there's some awareness between the two of them that the old man, played it fast and loose with certain things in a way that they didn't want to do. So, but they again were swimming in waters where they were fending off the CIA, battling with the mafia, but also the mafia is deep in the political process. So it's hard to move things forward without having some interaction with them. And so this is a whole kind of arc that I think you get into when you get around the Kennedys. But the idealism is there to lead the world into a better place. And this is what makes them dramatic enemies of the deep state. And that's something that comes into focus here in this next segment. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, Castro Atlantis mystery. We're going to take your questions here shortly. And Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I got a lot of stuff about Castro. Kelly says, do you believe Trudeau is Castro's son and installed in his position?
I think that the first part is true. One, he looks exactly like him. Two, we know that Margaret Trudeau found Castro fascinating. And Pierre Trudeau, it seems to me, he seems like the kind of politician that would need a beard, as it were. So to me, it's very easy for that. But we also know that she was kind of a party animal. And
kind of.
yeah, that's what we hear, that she hung out with the Rolling Stones and everything else. Now,
can I throw one more thing in?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Neil Lemuria says, Castro, does Castro have any interesting lineage? Andy B said, Castro came from old Italian royalty, i.e. ancient Aryan. Kevin Marble says, yes. Loren Murray did research of the Castro name, and they're linked to Iran and old money family known as I don't know how it's pronounced, Farnese or Farnese. If anybody wants to comment on that.
That is very interesting. I will say this in relation to Castro. As I mentioned, he came out of this very bourgeois background, and he was not a very good student. I find that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And two, he was very athletic, and he was a very good baseball player who aspired to get into the major leagues here, but it didn't happen. And so I had a little twinge of that, like,
Hitler parallel.
It is. Yeah. Hitler trying to get into the Vienna Art Institute and them refusing him, and all the effort he put into these paintings. And boy, does that set off his course in life. But yeah, there's no question that he put all of his emphasis on being a baseball player, interestingly enough. And in Cuba, they did develop some very good baseball teams. By the way, I love, I haven't been there, but I love so many things about Cuba, the architecture, the people, and the stories. So I could go on and on about that. This hotel, the Hotel International, is a remarkable setting for a lot of events that will happen that will really shape Cuba. One of them, of course, is this incredible get together of the mafia in 1946, where they have the main meeting of all the bosses. And this hadn't happened before. It happens later. There's another version of this that takes place, which is how organized crime gets on the map because the meeting is raided. But in Cuba, this takes place, and the entertainment that's flown over is Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra entertains all these mobsters in the middle of it. And he makes a deal, oddly enough, with some of these mobsters that he's going to come down there regularly. But interestingly enough, in order to avoid scrutiny, he is going to be coming down, and he's going to have developed the talents of an artist. So he's bringing an artist easel with him every time and carrying it himself. I'm going to show you pictures of that. But in fact, he is bringing money laundered from Las Vegas casinos down there directly. Sinatra goes through some very unusual waves in his career. He's huge when he's younger as a singer, and the Bobby Soxers love him. But very quickly, his audience gets older, and he is sort of shoved aside, and he becomes known as being difficult to record with and all the rest. And so the companies are like, forget this guy. We're not dealing with this. And what happens is Sinatra ends up having a remarkable life, but there's a lot of ups and downs going on there. And so he's at a low point in his life, in fact, when they ask him to come down and do this. But this is what gets us into some of that Sinatra, the mob setting him up. He has a relationship with the mob from a very early era because his dad owns a saloon and he is actually the entertainment in the saloon. And that whole area of New Jersey where he's growing up is just mob, it's encrusted with mob. And the mob owns that whole area. And it's funny because when you see him getting into trouble early on, and he's taken for breaking and entering here, he's doing these little jobs for the mafia. And what happens with him is, we have to remember this too with Sinatra, and why he's such a remarkable figure, incredible singer, artist, talented, great actor, and someone who does have a lot of soul. I don't think there's any denying that. But he's also beaten as a kid. And this is something we have to keep in mind with
by
him.
his mother.
By his mother. And
That's
his mother,
important.
there are accounts of this, and I don't want to be graphic with it, but it's not like he's spanked occasionally or something like that. The people would be shocked who were around her to see her punching him in the face as a kid. So this is the mentality that he grows up with the mother. It is, it instantly builds up the psychological profile of who he becomes, and dealing with people like the mafia who are around and seem to be almost a support system. I think his childhood sort of sets him up for that, for better, for worse. And Sinatra, it's interesting because he overcomes a lot, I think, of his demons in life, but he drags around with it for a long, long time. There's another set of stories about Sinatra, which is this incredible depressive wing of emotions that he goes through. And when he gets into relationships, how he blows them over and over again. And it involves a violent temper and then incredible lows of depression, obviously linked directly back to this. But I think that presence there of those emotional problems leads him directly into the wise guy circuit. And they think he's terrific. Hey, he's the top for them. He's Italian American like they are, and they can highlight him with their favorite songs. He has a great voice. He's their crooner. He's their guy, but he'll also do errands for them, and he'll also sing for the dawn, and so he's kind of an ideal person for all this. What's interesting is the extent to which he makes it, because not only does he become this darling of the mafia and then create this incredible Hollywood career on top of his musical career, but then he gets into the political aspect. And but the dates, I think, are interesting. 1946 is really when he becomes a made man through this performance there in Cuba for the mafia, the great mafia get together. And that hotel international will play a key role in all of this, because of course it's also where Kennedy will go down and meet Meyer Lansky in 1957. And so there's a whole tie over from that. And remember, I'm going to read a couple of things tonight about Joe Kennedy's business dealings in Cuba that will give us, it's more than just, hey, it's a president who slams into a geopolitical situation. It's, I'm a guy whose family has a big history down there. I know it. I know a lot of the players, and I know the whole thing with the mob that's going down there too. But the other person that he knows there and who helps him with the 1960 election is Frank Sinatra, who thinks, aha, this is a guy I can, get as a liaison, myself as a liaison between the mafia and the president. So Sinatra's going for that role in a very hardcore way. And what's interesting is it's going to take Bobby Kennedy to get Sinatra off the scent of being the president's intermediary, because Bobby Kennedy starts to look into the various people that are working with Sinatra, and he says, this guy is mafioso, this guy who's running your club in Las Vegas is a mafia, like this guy. And so before the inauguration, but after the election, he says to him, you can do the inauguration, but you have to get rid of those people. And Sinatra says, no problem. I can do that, and I'll do that for Jack. And he gets rid of them. He does the inauguration, then he hires them all back. And then, of course, Bobby is attorney general, and he says, aha, you hired them all back. What do you think you're doing? You have to get rid of them. And he says, well, Junior, I already have my relationship with Jack, and, I'll talk to him about it. He's the president. He's the man. And so RFK goes directly to JFK and says, you can't, he's going to link you with mafia figures here and there. You can't do anything with him. You can't stay with him when you travel and all this kind of stuff. And that is how the Kennedy-Sinatra relationship slips away. But leading into 1960, it's certainly a vital piece of all this. And Sinatra understands those waters. One of the people that Sinatra has introduced Kennedy to is Judith Exner, who will become, his mistress for a while. And what's interesting about this is this is one of the rehash sort of counterfeit conspiracy things that they're putting out there, which is now they have stuff that they're putting out about Judith Exner. Oh, Judith Exner is so important in all this, but you have to understand her connections properly. So we've put a number of things about Judith Exner out there, but I think what's crucial is at a certain point, she is being used by the Kennedy White House as an intermediary with Sam Giancana. And a lot of people suspected that since Giancana was being hired by the CIA to bump off Castro, that in fact Kennedy was a part of this by sending these messages back and forth. But if you go into her account, including the time that she actually looked at what Kennedy was sending back and forth, part of what he was getting were blueprints. And Giancana was getting them from military contractors. And they're blueprints for airspace craft. So there's something much deeper than the whole hey, he's sending him money to bump off Castro. What they want people to go to sleep and go to have a very comfortable history of back in those days, the CIA did this stuff with the mafia, but don't worry, the CIA are all set now. And the whole reason that the Kennedy thing happened was, if it wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald's story, you have this backup story of the mafia did it. And they've had that hanging out in the wings. So it's for their own protection. And interestingly enough, in this 2024 election, we have something incredible going on, which is that RFK Jr. and Trump, when they got together there on stage in Arizona, pledged to release the JFK records. And this is significant because there's some kind of booby trap left in those records that Bobby Kennedy did that they couldn't get rid of. That's what I've become convinced of. And so that's why those records have been held up all of this time. But the ultimate sort of scapegoat for so many of these activities around the assassination that the CIA has employed, their scapegoat has always been, the go-to is the mafia, because, hey, you can't deny that the mafia does hits and all the rest. But the problem with that whole scenario and the counterfeit conspiracy that they pushed there, and why Netflix will do a special on, hey, JFK hit by the mob and all that kind of stuff, they're not going to tell you the truth about the CIA being involved. And so that's a problem. And they also make it, they're going to make you watch for the sexy details, like, hey, JFK was high as a kite and he was having orgies, and there's some things that are on the record about his life, but other things are just, you can just throw in anything about Kennedy at this point and it'll be accepted, right? So the CIA still puts the talking points out there: the millionaire playboy, reckless, and basically implying, well, he deserved to be assassinated. And also implying, this is the other CIA tactic, implying that he was behind bumping off Marilyn Monroe and things like that. So what they do is, for the people that in their own past and that hangs around them as an intelligence agency that they've bumped off, and that they've had these plots against, what they do is they hang their own crimes on their victims. And then now we have, as media, things like Netflix and others. It's not just Netflix, of course. It's anything from ABC to Paramount and all the rest. They promote this because so much of the intelligence agencies control what we get. And they do want to control how that past is perceived, because if you get wise to it, then you're in a totally different understanding about where the power lies in all of these different situations. That's a key aspect for us to think about, and it comes into play here in the next piece. Everyone, you're watching Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, the Castro Atlantis mystery, taking your questions here momentarily as we go deep into the Hot Zone for the organized crime players, but also the archaeological mystery at the heart of the Hot Zone. Before I go any further,
That was great, DJ.
Yes.
I appreciated that. Speaking of Netflix, Liddy Lou says, DJ, how has Castro's death changed the game in the Hot Zone? Is Obama involved?
Well, what you can say about Obama, and it's a very short-lived victory, which is Obama finally improved relations at the very end, and I mean the 8th year of his administration. And the Obama administration is largely the clerk for the bankers and setting up what they were going to do with COVID and everything else, by creating that healthcare system that got everyone's digital information. So I don't have any good things to say about the Obama administration, but interestingly enough, they opened up this communication with Cuba and then acknowledged them, and they were doing all these things, and they put up a new embassy in Cuba, and relations had thawed, as it were. But it was also kind of flimsy the way it was handled. It was right at the end of his administration. They didn't make a big deal of it with him arm in arm with the leaders of of Cuba. So it was a missed opportunity in a lot of ways, and it was just done as a kind of a half-baked thing at the end of his administration. And as soon as Trump came in, instantly this whole thing started about Havana syndrome, where these electromagnetic weapons were being used on personnel in American embassies. What you'll find that's particularly interesting about that is they were the types of electromagnetic and acoustic concussions and all these strange things. The symptoms, even when they left the embassy, so if somebody would leave Cuba and come back to America, the symptoms of Havana syndrome would continue. So somebody was employing this and does not want those relations to thaw between the United States and Cuba. And for my money, the deep state is right at the heart of that. But it's very unusual still because there's no explanation about Havana syndrome except the CIA's comment that, like, well, it doesn't appear to be any foreign actor. Well, maybe it's you guys. But it is, I find that very interesting. Yeah. What do you got?
This is really interesting. Oldest Dirt says, since they have just released in the science journals that we have an electric belt around our Earth, does DJ think that this ties into the hot zone, the energy we were missing?
Oh, I'm sure that there's a great deal. And when I read you some things from Zelitzky's allegory and her story about this dog who finds something incredible in Cuba, I guess I should actually get into that right now. But it's going to get directly to what you're talking about, which is it's dealing with unknown factors in the magnetic field of the Earth. Quite remarkable. So just to round out a couple of things about Frank Sturgis, and then I'm going to read from our friend Zelitsky, and then we'll go to questions. How's that? All right. This is our friend talking about, just for the record, being in Virginia Beach. So they asked him to give some accounting of his past, and he said, well, I had a nightclub that I was involved with called Top Hat Nightclub in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I was part owner in that. Mr. Arthur Bass was my patron and also my partner. Before I went with him to the nightclub, I was part owner of this bar, and then we sold the bar, and that's when I started the Merchant Marine thing. So just before he takes off and does the I'm a Cuban revolutionary, he's there for 3 years in Virginia Beach. I find that interesting. So they're asking him, well, basically, is there any point when you're helping Castro when you think maybe this isn't such a good idea? And he says, well, I start hearing things, and what I notice and what's odd is that the CIA seems to be helping this guy out. So this is directly from his testimony now. This is Sturgis. As a matter of fact, Ambassador Smith accused the CIA chief of station at a meeting with the other agents of being pro-communist by having a close association with the Castro brothers. And that's Ewing Smith who was raising this. Now, I find that interesting because there's some aspect in the intelligence agencies helping Castro. All you want to, play out, that you see in the books and all the rest of it is all these different ways that the CIA try to kill Castro and all the rest. But they're putting him in. That has to be clear, I think, with all this. All right, a little more. Sturgis, you must understand one thing. When I was associated myself with Colonel Nichols, I received bits and pieces from the colonel that many of the people, that you can't trust some of the people in the CIA there. As I went along, I found out that CIA did help Fidel, guide him into power. The communists, Cuba's Communist Party, did make a couple of attempts to kill Fidel, and I believe the CIA was advising Fidel of what was going on and so forth. They were very pro-communist, these agents. Now, so there's a straight up Communist Party there. They're trying to kill Castro, but he's a socialist communist also. So, and the CIA is trying to get this lefty to take over for Batista. That doesn't make sense with what happens later, which is they think, well, we're going to have to take this guy out in order to restore Cuba. Well, there has to be some piece there, and it is true that on the record, it's some surprise when he turns so communist. But there's something disturbing that's left out, I think, in all of this, which is for them not to have known that he was that close on the communist side, and then for them to be helping him in the background. We don't hear much about that now, do we? Why is the CIA helping Castro get into power when they have their right-wing strongman there? Here's another thing. In 1958, we stopped selling arms to Cuba because we don't have faith in Batista, supposedly. When has that ever stopped us before? As long as they're on our side, usually we go for it. So that leaves Batista open to Castro's invasion. And in fact, he asked the United States for help over and over again. But they're done with him. For some reason, they're done with him. And they're willing to take a chance that this lefty coming in is going to serve their same purpose. It doesn't work out that way, but I think it's an important piece of the record that's often overlooked. Okay, a little bit more on that. Oh, yeah. So we're going to bring in this thing relating to the Vatican here. And this is going to play into Zelitsky's piece. But this is fascinating. I found this as an anecdote in a memoir. And they're talking about when John F. Kennedy, as a young man, inherits this money from his family and then goes all over Europe. And supposedly what he's doing is acting as an intel agent for his father, who's ambassador in the UK. And so there's a gifted sculptor named Irina Wiley, and she writes, quote, Jack, when he visited us, was a youngster. He visited us in Riga when I was doing an altar of St. Teresa, my favorite saint. The altar consisted of small panels depicting the life of the saint. In one of these, an angel leans over her while she is writing the book that made her beloved even by non-Catholics. I needed a model for the angel, and Jack, with his curly hair and youthful serenity of expression, was literally a godsend. He sat for me patiently and is rewarded by having the privilege of being the only American president and with his likeness in the Vatican, where the altar is now. I found that quite remarkable because when we get into the next piece on this, the Vatican goes heavy in the HotZone piece. And that is, of course, the Harvard Yearbook of John F. Kennedy. And
Is there a picture of that sculpture?
that's a good question. I have not run across it yet, but that would be
That's
a thing.
strange
Yes,
that it wouldn't be
Yeah.
available on the internet.
absolutely. I'm sure if somebody digs through her art aspects
Mhm.
that they're going to find it, but we haven't got it yet. All right. Now, Zelitsky's allegory and its key to the HotZone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Wise Guys in the HotZone, Castro Atlantis mystery, going deep on the combination of these very, very strange ruins and the legends around them, the psychic work of Edgar Cayce, Hemingway and his secret network, and the Wise Guys in Castro. Somehow, this huge, sprawling geopolitical scene that almost brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, let's not forget. And again, it seems like when we get into these tensions between Russia and America, it's always Cuba that is the strange intermediary of the tension. So let's bring it around now and remind you again that it is Paulina Zelitzky who had discovered the city off the coast of Cuba. I've shown her discoveries, which are quite remarkable. This is one of the pictures from the submersible of what she discovered. And it's clearly, a city and it's underwater, which changes history because the idea that there was an advanced culture that sank, would absolutely change the version that we have of history now, which is incredibly flimsy. So this whole story had to be suppressed, and it was. Now, thankfully for us, and like I said, I still have hopes of more back and forth with Paulina, and I have corresponded with her, and she has a lot of very interesting things to say. That is the area, of course, that we're talking about. I'm going to read a little bit of her very, very interesting comments. And then we're going to go to your questions. How's that
Okay.
sound? All right, let's do it. Here's what she has to say. The book is called Dog Days of Cuba, and it takes a Doberman pinscher named Benz, like Mercedes-Benz, and it also mentions that he's named after Mercedes-Benz. And he's in Cuba, and he's this strange fairy tale allegory about her, basically, and what she did for Castro. But here's just a little bit of it. And the whole treasure search project is the Atlantean ruins. Remember that. Please tell us more, Commandante, if you can, about these new developments in your treasure search project, inquired Daddy Frank. So it's got a mommy and a daddy, and then this Doberman, Benz, and these Cuban officials are saying, we need your help with this treasure hunting project, which is what they did. They actually came to our friend Paulina, and they said to her, we need your help going off the western tip of Cuba. So they say, well, you probably remember the legend of the hidden treasures of the Cathedral of Merida, asked Commandante. Maybe you are right by suggesting that Benz, the dog, can help us. If only your equipment of your dog could assist us in locating the treasures in the caves. Now, remember those spirals that I showed you? Those are in caves. Nonetheless, in my opinion, everything here relates to the underwater ruins she found. The caves of Guanaca Bibis. These would justify my addressing your concerns with Fidel himself. Good idea, Commandante, she said. Could you please update us about your new developments in your project? Well, the matter is, as I mentioned before, on orders from our Commandante El Jefe, Fidel Castro, we commissioned the study by a professional team of Cuban historians and anthropologists of archival data of these hidden treasures in the caves. The whole story is about the early days of the conquest of Mexico and the treasures kept in the cathedral of San Ildefonso in the city of Merida in Yucatan, the first and oldest cathedral in Mexico. Now, notice there that Yucatan is used. So we've got Cuba, the western tip of Cuba, and Yucatan going on here. Remember the dangerous Cabo de San Antonio, Cape of San Antonio. Now, the Cape of San Antonio is very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's the jumping off point for the western tip of Cuba where they find the ruins. Two, in that story that I relayed about Thomas Townsend Brown, the scientist, when I talked to his daughter, she said that after he died, they found out that when he was saying that he was going for a month every year with Robert Sarbarker, this physicist, to San Antonio, that for all these years, up until the revolution anyway, he'd been going to San Antonio, Cuba. Very different than San Antonio, Texas. So every year after World War II, but before the revolution, so 14 years there, Thomas Townsend Brown would go for a month to San Antonio, Cuba. What he was doing down there, they have no idea. But the ruins and the things that she's talking about here, she's talking about exactly San Antonio, Cuba again. She says, the pirates were chasing them closely for several days, fast approaching them near San Antonio. It would be a matter of hours before the fastest pirate ship would reach the galleon Princesa de Toledo, carrying treasure, which was detained by the waters of the Yucatan Strait. And then she mentions these 4 friars that were carrying these treasures. Not to risk the valuable treasures in the battle with pirates and hide them, they set out to hide them in the caves of the Cape of San Antonio until the end of the conflict. The treasure is of incalculable value, consistent with a large volume of massive gold, golden discs, bars, coins, religious, and native jewelry. I hope you get the list and some description of this treasure. This might be helpful. Do you know what happened next? Asked Frank. The sailors unloaded the treasure on the beach, found the nearby cave, and hid it there. They marked the location of the cavern and drew a map. Okay, so remember, this is all allegory, and there's a dog in this story. It's like a fairy tale, but it is an exact correlation to her experience going there because she's mentioning all these key things that she was involved with, like the underwater city and all the rest of it. So here she is laying it out for us, giving us the hints of this is what they found, but it gets better. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Meanwhile, probably thanks to the protection of Commandante tainted, and my successful search for the lost treasures. This is the dog Ben's talking. So successful search for the lost treasures. This is after the fact. The status of our joint venture in Cuba and the relationship with our Cuban boss, Colonel Beltrain, changed toward the temporal peaceful coexistence. We received the highest permission to continue working with our old Cuban friends. And remember, nobody is allowed to drop a word about the cave that we found. Spreading any rumors about it will be considered treason. The treasures are at Cabo de San Antonio. Now, let's get to this directly. When she found the Atlantean ruins, what she's saying here is some of the things that she found, apparently the Cuban officials were saying nobody's allowed to drop a word about the cave that we found, the actual location. Spreading any rumors will be considered treason. So this is what she's recounting, you can see here as part of her own experience. And then she starts to talk about during the search, strange thing happens, which is all of her instruments go off the charts while she's searching for this lost city. And again, it's Dog Days in Cuba, Quest for Treasure. That's the name of the book. It's a fairy tale allegory, and yet it's written by Zelitsky, who found the actual story, who found the actual ruins. Quote, our humans were worried about their compasses still not functioning. The same happened to Giovanni when he attempted to start his metal detectors. The needle of his instruments were also turning around in chaos. This is the apophthegm that takes place in certain parts of the HotZone. This is why the whole San Antonio area is called sorda, deaf, meaning no radio and electromagnetic signals could be detected there, commented Paco. Look at the marine navigational maps and you will see the marine channel running parallel to the whole coast of San Antonio is called Paso Sorda del Muerto, deaf channel of the dead. A pretty nasty name, and nobody knows why. We suspect that there are uranium deposits somewhere in the area. Rubia and I were less concerned about lost magnetic signals. We went around the dark lake to the center and noticed the slight movement of water downstream. The weird formations on the walls, ceiling, and the floor shaped it into unimaginable forms. Some were draped and others were like rock flowers. It is magic, she said. A true artist creating these structures. They are apparently made of crystal, marveled Giovanni. There's your HotZone, Two-Eye Stone tie-in. All in the strange allegory of the book of this dog Benz that helps Fidel Castro find ancient treasure in Cuba, written by Ocean Engineer Paulina Zelitsky. The last thing on this I'll say is, so here we are. That's the last quote from the book. 10 men and 1 dog forming a brand new pack to search for ancient Mexican treasure in the remote caves of Cabo de San Antonio. Now, that's such an explosion of information from Paulina Zelitzky, but what she's telling us is that the information from the excavations that she did while she was in Cuba, these are things that she can't come out and write sort of a direct book on all of them. So here, through the story of the dog and his discoveries as a fairy tale, she's giving us the exact pinpointed thing. And right in the heart of it is Castro. And Castro is directing the search and trying to get the details on the search. And while she's doing the search, she's finding all these ruins. She's finding the two-eye crystal. She's finding all these hieroglyphs and all the rest of it. Now, what happens is, according to the rest of the fairy tale, is Castro uses this to lure down the Pope to Cuba. The Pope visits Cuba in 1998, which is very interesting historical detail in real life. But what Castro wanted to do was compare what they had in the Vatican library versus what he was finding off the western tip of Cuba. You're going to understand as time goes along here just how explosive this information from Zelitsky, which only came out fairly recently, but deciphered through the lens of the HotZone that we're looking through tonight, is absolutely powerful info about Castro finding Atlantis off the western tip of Cuba, and her story of trying to keep this story out there now, and having to go underground to a great deal with some of it, with her own strange and long history with the Castro regime, because after all, originally she went down there as a 22-year-old in the 1960s, looking, studying things between the Soviet Union and Cuba, oceanography, and then defected to Canada, and then Castro in the late 90s is like, I want you to come back here. I'm looking for Spanish galleons, i.e. HotZone treasures off the western tip of Cuba that relate directly to this lost culture of Atlantis. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Is this what you found right before tonight's show?
No. This is a piece of it. One of the things that I'm going to add is remarkable. But go ahead.
All right. So let's start off there. Janine Moonshine says Castro and his brother are Jesuits. Roger Z says, I read this differently. Dog Days of Cuba. The Doberman Pinscher is a German creation, a mailman bred. So she's indicating a German involvement, perhaps some brought over through Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, there's a few things there. I think what you want to do is the Benz part, I think, is interesting. There's a story about Benz in there and how Benz gets the name, and it's because the owner has this attachment to Mercedes-Benz. But certainly there's incredible overlaps of German interest in Cuba and German interest in the HotZone. No question about it. The allegory, however, and how she's putting it across is directly related to the search for the Hall of Records off the coast of Cuba. And she is relating her interaction, and she's always showing the Cuban officials being kind of hypocritical. As a matter of fact, her own description of what she's doing with the book on the back cover, I think is quite amusing. But for our purposes, remember, from the point of view of dark journalism now, when you go into the search for Atlantis, the thing that you encounter is apotheum when you get into those areas of the HotZone. I've had people tell me that who have done searches down there and have signed NDAs with the military and other people, that they can't reveal the ruins that they see down there. But some of the things that they talk about, they talk about compasses spinning backwards and all magnetic reference. If you there's a very interesting story by a guy who worked at AUTEC, and he saw off the coast, now while he was working at AUTEC in Cuba, which is again Guantanamo, he saw an actual continent, a landmass on his radar. He said, what is that? And he went back to it over and over again. It was a gigantic landmass right underneath the surface. And so that just appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared again. So there's a lot of things when you're dealing with the HotZone. You're dealing with, when you get into apotheum, none of the traditional points of reference apply. Just like when you deal with the UFO phenomena, it's pure apotheum. So the apotheum UFO file, the way we put those things together, there's no, take a classic case like Betty and Barney Hill, for example. You have missing time, right? They float them off the ground. All these things defy traditional physics. So you're introducing a different kind of physics. But what happens when UFOs are seen? All the magnetics, the electromagnetic spectrum turns upside down. So whenever you get around X technology, which is a very ancient discovery, remember the Atlanteans were using this, you get these apotheum effects. The thing is, the reason that the X technology is in the UFO file is because they both do the same thing. So as does the development of the Tesla work, for example. It creates things that, you don't see in regular physics. It's the introduction of a different order of physics. in the UFO abduction experience, you get taken through a wall. Well, there isn't a physics model for dematerialization like that under ordinary circumstances, right? So, but obviously there is a technology level that exists that can do it because there's so many accounts of it. So, yes.
This is such a great comment. Just a side comment. CRCR1 says, wow, if the mob is your safe space to escape your mother, that's a very tough childhood.
That's
Okay,
the Sinatra part.
yeah.
Yeah.
So getting back to what we were saying about the dog. I'm not dead yet says, what about the bends, BENDS, that condition that divers get when they come up from the depths too fast and they get the bends. Kate Garcia says, Germany made the Mercedes-Benz.
Yep.
Caritas Tarot says, my gut says Benz and the car company from Germany were chosen for a reason. Perhaps look at World War II connections to the company owners, something like that. Roger Z says Pope John II was former member of the Nazi Youth Brigade. He wanted to, interestingly enough, he wanted not to be in the U.S. during the lunar eclipse. And Wally Tango Foxtrot, last one, says, studied the Jesuits' early colonies in Paraguay, like a beta version of Jonestown, early Marxism.
Those are all very interesting. Those are great observations. You have to, though, when you're dealing with the hot zone, what you want to do is orient yourself toward this idea of Poseidia as part of Cuba, Bimini, and other pieces of it, because you have to get the location going. There's a reason for the location of the hot zone. So that's the only thing that I hear missing in some of those. What I would say also is the unusual magnetic fingerprint of that area, which is why it's used for so many NASA programs and why it's such a hot spot of, it's so common in Bimini to see UFOs. They call them fireflies, for example. Why the stories that you have about the Bermuda Triangle with things disappearing and reappearing, like those land masses off of Autek. And then in that area, you still have something of the two-eye stone emanating something. Because remember, the two-eye stone almost took the Earth out. So even 10,000 years later, it's still going to maybe have a kind of a radioactive fallout effect magnetically. So this is something to keep in mind when we get there. Somebody did mention the Pope there, and I'm glad they picked up on that, because the Pope was the whole, this idea of the comparison of the Vatican library information about Atlantis and the hot zone with the Castro discovery is so crucial, and something that she's putting on the record here. She hasn't mentioned this before. Here's something that comes directly from the book, Dog Days in Cuba. Again, quote, it might be possible to negotiate the reopening of communist Cuba to the Catholic religion. So remember, this takes place when she's out there. It's the late 90s. So Castro came up with the idea that the Vatican could help. He came up with the idea that the Vatican could help Fidel Castro in locating these treasures in exchange for the invitation of Fidel Castro for Pope John Paul II to visit Cuba. This happened. This took place in 1998. We're getting oriented. What is it about 1998 out there in the ideas room that's so crucial? Do you remember? Go into the Cayce work. 1998 is the crucial year. It's the crucial year where everything changes. It's the beginning of the testing period. The great change that's taking place in humanity. Cayce would go to 98 over and over again, not saying 98 is going to be a big disaster like 2012. No, but it sets the tone for a new period. This is the real meaning behind the whole 2000 piece. Now, such a visit would largely help to reopen Cuba to the Catholic Church. Additionally, the Vatican would be willing to reward Cuba financially for the safe recovery and in return of its valuables. They agreed on the amount of reward, and the Cardinal commissioned Giovanni to assist our friend in his efforts to find the treasures of the Cathedral of Merida. This is how Giovanni was sent by his uncle, the Cardinal, to work with Comandante Tainted, this is what she's calling him, in Cuba, to organize the expedition and the team of local guides and specialists of confidence. Giovanni was asked to investigate the use of the latest technology in metal detection to find gold and silver stored inside the caves, while Fidel Castro will prepare his country for the forthcoming visit of Pope John Paul II. So we get oriented time-wise to 1998. We know that the discovery of the Cuban cities is announced in 2000, 2001. So we're getting a timeline here of when these discoveries took place. And before that, 1997, we have JFK Jr. meeting with Fidel Castro. So we're getting the pieces there, I think, are falling directly in line. There was a conversation that took place here about advanced ruins that were found off the coast of Cuba. This was the story that was covered over. This is where archaeology dropped the ball on purpose, but this is the clue and the key to this Atlantis Rising piece. Yes.
Esoteric 369, did Castro get any Vatican records from the Pope?
In her story, this is what they're offering. You know, we don't have anything on record of him giving things to Castro, but obviously the reason she's putting it in the story is she's giving us the information. You see, we need to go beyond what's available and figure out, based on our information, based on the X series, based on the research and the mystery school piece, what is it that somebody who found not just a structure off the coast of Cuba, but found a metropolis and then was harangued and thrown in prison and basically chased back to Canada? What is the meaning of her putting out a book now that's an allegory? It's not even a book of, factual scientific research. It's an allegory about a dog that helps Castro find ancient ruins. The key is resting in that work. And even in her own description of it, which I did print out and I can read here, you can see that she's saying basically, yes, I'm I'm putting this across as an allegory of my actual experience. Here's what she has to say. Cuba, where the new atheist state has sent most priests and nuns into forced labor camps for re-education, expel them from the island. Benz the Doberman, adopted by a foreign joint venture in Cuba, lived on the island, enjoyed numerous adventures, and interacted with the protagonists of the story on many levels. As a dog lover and an animal rights activist, the author felt that the new alternative perspective on social political conditions in Cuba through the eyes of the heart of the Doberman Benz would help to reveal the naked king, a complex, many-layered story of political, socio-economic power grab in Cuba. It is a biting satire of power and how it corrupts the inept bureaucracy, allowing brutality or arbitrariness to debase ordinary Cuban people. And so she's masked this whole piece of the Atlantean discovery in basically a social satire, which is actually a very clever way to do it. Benz, a Doberman puppy, is rescued by a foreign scientist working in a joint venture with Cuba in the late 1990s. Sound familiar? Being accused of Benz, a dangerous dog, by his Cuban military boss, Benz escapes execution by joining a team of Cuban scientists in the capacity of ORE, search dog, risking his life by diving into the lakes of dangerous caves of Cabo San Antonio, located in the peninsula of Guanahacabibes, the westernmost point of the island, the western tip of Cuba. That's where the ruins are. He assists in the search for the lost valuable treasures of this cathedral of San Defonso of Merida. Benz recorded his adventures in caves and love affair with a local mongrel dog using a brain clone helmet. I'm telling you, this book, the pieces of it that she's putting out there, there's a lot, and I mean a lot in here. Yes, Miss
It's all
Olivia.
code.
It is, and
It's
it's
incredible.
remarkable. By the way, Benz is a Doberman. If that helps you, go ahead.
Okay, so back to that image of Paulina.
Yes.
Ray Story said, I noticed the symbols were not spirals per se, but concentric circles.
Yes.
And Rotten Crypto Bit says, resident frequency tech maybe worked better with concentric circles. Matty Mosef noted, wasn't the city of Atlantis arranged in concentric circles?
That's very true. Actually, you can see them. There's a close-up one of that. Some of them there. And that's an excellent point. Well, you know, what's interesting is that cave now was discovered in 1922. So people have had a long time to work with it in the background outside of the things that we hear about. And I'll be honest with you that until I was doing my own research, I had never run across that cave in any of the books that dealt with the subject, which is interesting. I think it, you know, but if you look at the work of Egerton Sykes and the unusual thing, he didn't write any big books. Like I said, he edited a lot of the Atlantis literature, including Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He would put out new editions and edit them, and he would do a forward and things. But he had this regular Atlantis journal, which I luckily got access to every copy of it because one of his students who had originally worked at the ARE kept an electronic copy of all of them. And this was a remarkable piece of information. That's also from that cave region, very unusual sculpture. But I do think that, you know, there's something else I want to say, which is Egerton Sykes, even though he felt that the ARE wasn't really fulfilling its Atlantis mission the way he thought that Cayce would want them to. And remember, he had all kinds of correspondence between 1934, 35, and 36 with Cayce. And that's kind of prime time for the Bimini readings and Atlantis readings. So I think, you know, he had a good edge there about what was happening. But when I would mention on this show a few years ago that the ARE had kept the room of the Egerton Sykes stuff in kind of just this massive room and nobody could really get at it, it's very interesting because within a short time, like a year later, they developed a digital catalog of all of the works of Egerton Sykes that he had donated his library there. And they had done this incredible job of digitizing the whole thing. And now it looks fantastic. It looks like a fantastic database of information about Atlantis, the way that I guess it was originally envisioned. So I know that the ARE is actually looking for a new CEO, and I hope that
Would
they
you
get.
take the job?
Well, I'm too busy with the X series, but I'll tell you this: if they could get somebody really fantastic in there, I think the time is right for the Cayce stuff to just explode because so many of the things that he's put on the record has come to pass. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 175, Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, the Castro Atlantis mystery. There's more to get into about Castro, more to get into about the Wise Guys, and more to get into about the Hot Zone archaeologically and on a real heavy-duty technological level. So we may do a tie-over episode, a part 2 episode on this. In the meantime, we're taking your questions. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and gets around the massive, and I mean massive, censorship and you know, which is so ridiculous now from Google that you can't even really find Dark Journalist if you try. They give you all these bizarre results. And in YouTube as well, but there's a reason for that. And I don't spend too much time on it. What I do is I do as much work as I can on these social media networks, but the best way to stay directly in touch with the work that we're doing is to go to darkjournalist.com and to stand up and be counted. Get on the newsletter list for that free newsletter, and you'll get the most important updates on interviews, X series episodes, documentaries, live events, all the incredible things we have coming up for you later this year. So make sure that you stand up and be counted and do that. Miss Olivia, we'll take a couple more questions.
This is interesting. Golden Girl says Ben's had hovercraft for the elite since turn of the century.
Yeah. Well, we know that there's the whole piece around the Nazi regime and Benz. So Let's just say that's a pretty good fit, as it were. Yes.
Okay. The Desolate One. DJ, do you think there's an active UFO base in the hot zone? And El Cid Barrett, if there are ruins, would you build an underwater base if you thought old tech might be there?
Yes. Yes. Because they have a program for discovering sacred objects, advanced technology objects, anything that gives them an advantage. You have to go back to the stories of Hitler. Some of the reasons he gives for going into Austria is he wanted to get the Spear of Destiny out of this museum. And in fact, they have this whole thing of once they do the Anschluss, where they march into Austria on a sort of bloodless march. He walks right into that museum and takes the Spear of Destiny. So, they understand on that level the power of the sacred objects. That's one aspect. But there's an actual physical effect that takes place, and knowledge of those advanced weapons from the past, and knowledge of the Two-Eye Stone, things of that nature. It's very interesting. If you go deep into the Cayce readings, when he's talking about the Hall of Records, he'll say, in the Sphinx, you're going to find not only all these various tablets of the histories of the Atlanteans, but you're going to find information about the construction of the Two-Eye Stone network. Well, governments would very much want to get their hands on that for a lot of reasons. That technology was incredibly advanced, one. And two, how it would tell us about who we are as a culture. You see, we spend a lot of time around this sort of alien aspect with the UFO thing. And it's important, I think, to get the UFO file information correct, because there's so much bogus stuff that comes out through the CIA and, the bozos like Elizondo and that kind of thing. But I think the bigger transformation, the bigger piece of disclosure is who we are. So if we are these advanced Atlanteans at a certain point, that's part of our own history. And I think what we would look at in terms of off-world cultures are peer relationships. They aren't saviors. They are, they're peers, right? So, but the revelation that we are advanced is, for me, absolutely powerful. Yes.
There's fantastic comments in here. You're going to have to mind the chat. Okay, so David Tormena has a tome here. DJ, isn't it interesting that Castro and Che Guevara are both descendants of Atlantean refugees, the Canary Islands for Castro and the Basque for Che?
Oh, yeah.
The OSS actively recruited the Basque in the 1940s, what they called the Special Intelligence Agency. The original director of this Special Intelligence Agency was also placed in charge of the Tesla papers. Hoover was highly angered when the CIA eventually took over this operation. The CIA took over the op right after that FBI agent was mysteriously killed in a plane crash out of South America, supposedly on his way to meet Eisenhower about a Nazi plot.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Well, it sounds like another episode too. It is. You have to look into. Che is interesting also in this, because he's the other half of the revolution, right? And he's an absolutely crucial figure. And what do they do with him after the Cuban Revolution? Well, the Soviet Union becomes disenchanted with him because he's demanding all these things, and he supposedly is against nuclear weapons, which I find interesting also. But he goes into various countries, African countries, South American countries, trying to foment revolutions. And somebody is funding that through Cuba. And it is actually in Bolivia that his luck will run out trying to foment a revolution in the mountains there. And it's funny because the CIA had made a deal originally with the Bolivian government that they were going to spare Che and use him against Castro. And I think he died, I would say 67 or 68. So this is a good, almost 10 years after the revolution. And so this CIA guy goes on record, and I've watched him being interviewed. And then the call comes down from the president of Bolivia and says, no, we've decided, he's too much of a risk. You're going to have to execute him. And the way the story is told, it's almost a sad story. But then you think about Che and Castro and how they put all these, people they regarded as enemies to the revolution under their firing squads and things. So those stories, I think what you have to say about these people, Che and Castro, is that they are remarkable people. There's no question about it. But they were not, in many ways, they turned into exactly what they were supposedly fighting against, which is this kind of dictatorial nature and might makes right philosophy. Very disturbing if you think about it. I wanted to mention this, plug it in here, which is there was a very unusual set of space satellites sent over Cuba twice. And it was right at the beginning of the Kennedy administration in 1961. Before the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had no thought that there would be Cuban missiles in there, Soviet missiles at Cuba. It was this very unusual project called SOLRAD. And SOLRAD was the public designation for a combination surveillance and solar X-ray and ultraviolet scientific satellite. Now, what's interesting, SOLRAD-2 was launched in November 30th, 1960. So Kennedy is president-elect, but he hasn't assumed office yet. Technically, Nixon is vice president and Eisenhower's president. Both satellites failed to reach orbit when the booster flew off course and was destroyed, raining debris over Cuba. I believe that they were using satellites like SOLRAD to spy directly on the HotZone and see what they could get on it. I don't think that they were interested solely in what was going on the island. I think that they were using these because our own satellite technology only had kicked in supposedly in the 1950s, late 50s. So here they might have been seeing the key to the HotZone. This prompted official protests from the Cuban government. Hey, your satellites are breaking up and smashing down on the island. Later, there was a claim that one of these was grabbed intact, and then Cuba sold it to China, which developed an ICBM capability with it. Something weird about the project, but my opinion is that the kind of spying was going on for a reason, and it was not just geopolitical spying. I've had a picture of Gordon Cooper here somewhere, but Gordon Cooper, as we know, and I've pointed this out, that in his missions, he was doing something very interesting for Kennedy. Kennedy would ask him specifically up there to look at certain coordinates over Cuba. And what's interesting is if you get into that, you're going to see that Gordon Cooper was sent up there. And there was a whole program that they made later about this guy, and his dad had worked with Cooper, and Cooper had remembered, he had this remarkable memory. He remembered all the coordinates he was seeing from space, but he saw incredible things from space. And they said, well, what did he see? And of course, Spanish galleons, right? Because everything that is the HotZone is Spanish galleons. But if he was seeing those Atlantis ruins from above, and if he was getting maps for Kennedy based on this, then this also tells us things about the crisis in Cuba in that period. And isn't it a little bit strange that of all places that World War III was going to be fought out right there over Cuba? After all, we had Berlin. There were so many other places that would be ideal for this. Why did they stake so much on Cuba? I think the answer lies in the HotZone research. And this is the crucial part. Yes.
Back to David for a second. David Termina, that agent's name was Percy Ellsworth, head of the FBI Tesla investigation, which must have coordinated with Trump and the Special Intelligence Agency.
Yes, that is fascinating. There's an interesting trail there around Tesla's material also, which is immediately one of the trunks disappear. One of the trunks was held for a long time by the FBI, and eventually, the family, in combination with a museum in Serbia, would get it. But there were problems with the accounts of what he had versus what we ended up with. And what I found after a total accounting is that there are 2 trunks missing of Tesla's work. John Trump, with what he examined, he had to give the traditional answer of, I didn't find anything in those research papers that would pertain to what I was asked about, which was the ability of taking flying objects down at a distance with a death ray. So he was able to, put out the line that they wanted on this. But the fact that Vannevar Bush sends him in, and Vannevar Bush is in charge of the UFO file, I think is a huge earthquake indicator that, the Tesla information correlated with Trump and the UFO file aspect, that John Trump was in possession of remarkable technological information. And when we have Trump talking about his uncle and how he shared those things with him, watch out. Yes.
All right. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer wants to get right down to it. Does DJ think Castro knew the full extent of the ruins in Cuba and the whole Atlantis connection?
Yes. That's the point. That is the point. You've arrived at the crux of the report, which is Castro is in full knowledge of what he was looking at. That's where this remarkable thing that Zelitsky tells us, that it's related to trying to compare it with what's in the Vatican library. She's giving us an excellent key there if we're big enough to take it. And after all, he calls her in and says, I want you to look over here. And what does she find? She finds this incredible, remarkable Atlantean city. So he knows. Now, here's another thing. This story about a city off the coast of Cuba, remember, Ernest Hemingway's brother sees it. He sees it in the 50s. So it's been kicking around there for a long time. They've had decades to go down there and look at these things. There's the whole story that I've, really tried to spotlight about the national security incident that Kennedy was contemplating that was going to take place inside of Hemingway's villa. Well, Hemingway was long gone. Think of Bahia. From Cuba at the time. He was in America again. And so why would there be a national security incident? So they went to these. The paper itself was declassified in 2015, somewhere in there. And what happens if you really look at that story is very interesting. They go around to the Kennedy historians. They're like, we don't know about a nuclear or a national security incident inside of Hemingway's villa. We have no idea what that is. Well, the thing that we uncovered was that Mary Hemingway got Kennedy to rescue information that was in a vault in Cuba that was Hemingway's. And as I said, you're not going to risk a national security incident over some poems and half stories by Ernest Hemingway, as impressive as he was. But if he'd been for decades mapping the floor of the HotZone between Bimini and Cuba, and if they thought that they could get their hands on that, then I think that they would. So therefore, that's where I think the whole Hemingway-Kennedy HotZone network piece comes into play. And I think of it now more than ever because there's more that I'm discovering that's linking Kennedy directly with Hemingway. That's the shot of Cooper I was looking for before. Kennedy was sending him up there. He was known as Kennedy's astronaut at NASA. So these were the secret missions that Gordon Cooper was going up there for. By the way, Gordon Cooper knew all about the UFO file, and he talked about it publicly and wrote a letter to the UN with the president of Grenada saying, you know, we think that you should really release the information about this. We want to interact. And we did a remarkable episode of Gordon Cooper and the mysterious Valerie, who worked in the White House. And that's how we started this year. That's a very interesting episode. Yes.
Ratboy Genius, is there an esoteric connection between Atlantis and socialism, or was socialism a political excuse for revolution for Castro?
Well, I think that, you know, I think that they lived under more ideal circumstances and they were less materialist in that period, but you still had the Belial thing. We still have that now, if you think about it, for sure. But I think that there are models of socialism, you see, that would seem to be ideal, right? Everybody contributing and all the rest. But unfortunately, what happens over and over again with those socialist systems is they become centralized and they become control oriented. So that's a pretty deep conversation that you're suggesting there, and it's a worthwhile one about what would be the proper economic system. And I think certain things have come out supposedly about the Lemurian economic system, that the top person in the society would never make more than 10 times what the lowest earner on that scale would be. I think that there are models like that we'll have to move into, and at a certain point, we're going to look back at periods of intense capitalist competition as, you know, something outdated. But right now, what capitalism does is it guarantees the ability to work. And work is such a sort of a sacred, important aspect of human development. And so I think what they try to do very often is create this idea of, oh, hey, you know, you get some government subsidy and, you know, you won't have to do anything. But when you're not productive, there's no purpose for you. So work creates a purpose, any job, in fact. It's deep in the psyche. As a matter of fact, there's a labor strengthens theme throughout religions, and there's no question spiritually it's a perfect pattern of reward for labor. There's no question that is the spiritual nature of the thing. Yes, Miss Olivia.
If there were no freeloaders,
yes,
I wouldn't have a problem
that
really
is.
with social. That's the problem. Is what are you going to do about the freeloaders? Okay, Jessica Rodriguez. They say there are ancients living in the world with us. Do you think there is an active base of ancients in the Cuba waters where the ancient city was found? Do you think it is active, and that is why the compass goes nuts?
Yeah, I think this is important. Actually, it's an excellent point. Whatever took place in the disaster that is recounted in the mystery school piece through the legends and everything else, but through the Cayce readings, we get a real lens. And that's why I think the Cayce readings on Atlantis are the most important. What he gives us an indication that the two-eyed stone is so advanced that when it was accidentally, and he says it was an accident, set too high, it set off all these incredible problems. And it almost basically destroyed the entire globe. So remember that the technology was born from a spiritual source, according to him. So that the Amelius group used it for certain types of interactions with the saintly realm. So that's how it was being used. But it could be turned physically as a weapon. And so this is a remarkable thing to ponder, I think, and it gives us all sorts of ideas of how this could have worked. But set in reverse and causing that level of destruction, which is where I think all the extegonography dates back to. That echo of that terrible event coming through all the different legends and everything else, there's an after effect of that technology of that network going down the way that it did, because it was plugged into everything. And it seems that one of the key places where you can still feel the after effects of it is right there in the hot zone. Here's an interesting little piece. And it's just a final thought on the Zelitsky book. And it's one of these overviews. It says, according to Zelitsky, most of the episodes narrated in this novel happened in reality. So the whole allegory she's admitting up front is real. The company dedicated to underwater exploration, CARASUB, had fallen from grace, so the Cuban military took action on the matter through the companies of Geomar and Surmar. An obscure officer, Louis Fraga, then assigned to Zelitsky's company to act as a Cuban counterpart in the joint venture for the treasure hunt. After a hectic incident between Benz and that officer, which endangered the animal, they decided to include the dog in a new project that had nothing to do with the company, but rather as a personal arrangement. Benz was trained in sulfate and pyrite ore detection to help locate treasure that would be supervised by Fidel Castro himself. So, the allegory is to give kind of an overview of the situation that she found herself in, but I thought that was pretty interesting. And finally, Zelitsky recounts in reality that when Fidel Castro put himself on the trail of the loot, he wrote a letter to John Paul II asking for technological and information collaboration. What's interesting is if you don't understand the hot zone significance of what Zelitsky's putting out there, then none of this is going to make any sense. But if you understand that in the search around an ancient, advanced, lost culture, that in the Vatican, they would have the books that they keep in the Vatican library, not for public viewing, that someone like Castro would be aware. And so that's where this crisscross with his examination of the ruins based on what he found in the Vatican library, he wanted to compare the two to see if it's the same thing. That's why this is such an advanced piece. And I think also, if we get into it, our heads, the idea that the Pope came to visit Fidel in the same time loop that she's giving us, 1998. And then a couple of years later, another person who's very deep in the hot zone research aspect, John Lennon, is basically given a statue in Cuba, which seems like a remarkably strange thing. So that, along with the JFK Jr. visit in 1997, creates a thread of connecting dots, events that took place. Something major was going on in Cuba there. And I relate it directly to the hot zone because that's what came out in 2000 and 2001, the remarkable discoveries that they had made. And I think if you go around that period, you won't find many other things going on in Cuba that are that significant. So it seems to me this is the thing that he was getting at. Look, we found this. Just like when they had all the unusual visitors down to Antarctica, something had taken place. Some high mark had been achieved, and they needed the right people to go down there. Some of those people, John Kerry, Buzz Aldrin, what does Farrell talk about? The Russian patriarch going down there. So these are indicators that something big was taking place down there. 2 more questions, Miss Olivia.
Okay. All right. You've mentioned this before on other shows, but Brenda Fisher is asking, and is any mention made of Terramar a la Maxwell being in that Mar mix?
Well, no, that's interesting. Terramar is important because this is the ocean nonprofit that Ghislaine Maxwell put together. Ghislaine Maxwell's in my Hot Zone documentary, the Hacking Atlantis, Craze in the Hot Zone documentary, which is free on this channel. It's going to be a 6-part series, and we'll figure out how to produce it. But that's in there, and I highly recommend that you watch it because it contains information about Zelitsky and her role in all this, and why the deep sea submersible was called Atlantis, and why Stephen Hawking is going down there with Epstein and Maxwell. He's not there for Orgy Island. What is he doing there? He's there because there's the hunt in the hot zone for true Atlantis. And in their case, there's a Belial cult associated with Maxwell. Yes.
Last question.
Yes. This is it. You're
All
up.
right. I'm going to combine these two. Lazen River. There's a push for wireless electricity. Trump with RFK Jr., Musk, and Galbert. Will Trump push for tech that is being hidden? And also Blazing River, did JFK ever meet John G. Trump? What about RFK Jr. and Donald Trump? Any connection with them and John G. Trump?
Well, we know JFK Jr. was friends with Trump. I don't know. See, time-wise, the Trumps really came into prominence with Donald Trump, which is after the highlight era of the Kennedys. But then the Kennedys mixed it up with Trump in the 80s and 90s, and that's where John Jr. came in. And it's interesting because RFK Jr. sued Trump's companies for one reason or another, in New York. And so they have kind of a funny history. It's interesting because, of course, RFK sent out an email on top of his endorsement of Trump in Arizona. He says in this email, which came out today, support me, vote Trump. And that's more merging of knowledge. And this is a good thing because the knowledge base of Trump with the knowledge base of Kennedy, this is an unstoppable ticket if they get back into power. A lot of people are asking me, says Robert, if they live in a red state or a blue state, should they still vote for me? What about swing states? The answer is easy. No matter what state you live in, I urge you to vote for Donald Trump. The reason is that this is the only way we can get me everything I stand for into Washington, D.C. to fulfill the mission that motivated my campaign. A lot is at stake: the health of our children, integrity of the government agencies, and survival of our species as the Democrats push us closer and closer to World War III. That's Bobby. That's the nephew of JFK. He knows the deep state pushed his uncle and his father to that nuclear brink as well with their games, the same thing they're doing in Ukraine now, and got them out of the way and didn't allow Robert Kennedy to reclaim the White House Camelot mantle. So they assassinated them both. That is the nature of the structure running of the deep state, and they detest real competition. And the Kennedys had a vision of freedom and sharing the wealth, as it were. And they had a totally different game. Now, you have to think this about guys like Dulles and others. And I think I have a picture of Dulles here. But this is interesting. He, with his brother, John Foster Dulles, had been creating a certain type of a world where, America got what it wanted, or it overthrew who was there and got somebody else in. And, Kennedy wanted us to move in a totally different direction from that. So the clash between the two is just obvious. So what they decide to do on that front, they regard him dangerous also in that he wants to share the advanced technology piece with the Russians, and he's contacted them to share the UFO file aspects. He's reached out to his top CIA people to do that. After the Bay of Pigs, he gets Dulles to resign and take Richard Bissell with him. But Richard Bissell was Project Blue Book. He was the cover-up man for the whole UFO thing. So they're losing all the cover for the UFO piece. And a General Cabell, that whole group that gets thrown out with Dulles because they tried to bait Kennedy into a full-on invasion of Cuba. That is a huge crisscross that echoes now into the period that we're in. And the fact that there are the same games going on around Cuba, and that the war that they're engaged in, abroad is not Vietnam, it's, helping and assisting with the Ukraine, incredibly insane effort. So the great correlations for us, I think, being with Kennedy and Trump, that partnership, it's a remarkable period in time, and these revelations are coming to the surface. So certainly one of those revelations is what Paulina Zelitzky discovered, and the hot zone aspect that we've brought through. It's a historical piece. It moves, the Cayce Hemingway part of it is the 30s and the 40s, right? And before that, there's Steiner and anthroposophy in the 19 teens and 20s. Before that, Blavatsky. I mean, there's a thread here that picks up momentum at times, drops back, picks up momentum. Cayce dies in 1945, but his work isn't really discovered until 1968 with the Sleeping Prophet book. That's the bestseller. And the 60s are kind of the right mindset to pick up on all the things he's talking about. Well, Atlantis is a really big thing in the 60s and 70s. And you have people like Jacques Cousteau doing all these things on it. And again, in the 90s too. But there's a reason why it keeps coming back. It's surfacing from a subconscious place. And we're in that period of a great kind of human memory. I think this is the kind of key on this. That's why this episode in the hot zone aspect and bringing in Castro is crucial, because Castro is sitting in that period of time directly on this hot zone discovery. And God knows who he was sharing it with. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done for the evening.
I would like to add a wonderful comment. It's not a question.
Oh, yeah.
Jam says, thought of you, me, and DJ today have a litter of 4-week-old pups fussing about nap time. Played them a Gurdjieff CD of instrumental music, and I didn't even know we had them. It worked like a charm.
Wow.
Isn't that great?
Is it Gurdjieff de Hartmann
Probably.
or Gurdjieff harmonium? Those are very, there's an incredible thing. In 1948 and 1949, the last 2 years of Gurdjieff's life, he records albums of temple music on a harmonium. And I'm surprised that they didn't do more to clean up the actual recordings, because it's pretty easy to do. But nonetheless, they are incredible. And as is the de Hartmann music. So yeah, there's something incredible with the Gurdjieff work, and we shouldn't leave him out of this too. After all, in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, the whole thing is about him visiting Atlantis from space. Let's not forget.
Should we do a whole show on that?
Beelzebub? Absolutely. We've done a lot on Gurdjieff, and we have more coming up on him.
It's kind of a confounding book, from what I understand.
Oh, it's an incredible work. My God. It's loaded. It's loaded. But yeah, you're right. It's Ouspensky said it was intentionally inaccessible. But the Gurdjieff said you have to read it 3 times. First time, read it like you would any ordinary newspaper or magazine. Second time, really try to understand it. The third time, read it out loud. So that's a real test of a book, especially since it's like 500 pages. And with that, everyone, we're going to wrap up tonight. Your super chatters, Miss Olivia.
Okay, I want you to say happy birthday to Sarah Ann while I get the super chatters ready.
Happy birthday, Sarah Ann. And I guess, let's think about this. That makes you a Virgo, which is a remarkable sign. I've known many, many Virgos in life, and they are powerful.
They care intensely about specific things, and they don't care anything about anything else. All right.
That's a Scorpio there. Robert F. Kennedy Sr.
Yeah, he's quite a Scorpio.
Go for it.
Okay. Ramadasa, Tommy Van Gompel, Eurythmias Fun, Medley Childress, Alex Leggett, Descat Brock, Quantum Paradox, Wolfgang McCarthy, C.A. Beverforden, Kevin Bauman, Erica Swenson Elliott, Joseph Fabry, Norman Lee Smith Music, Emma Smith, Rhinoceros, Jackson, and Erica Swenson Elliott again. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow, what great support. We really appreciate it. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We really owe it to you for keeping us going in all the work that we do. We will be back with you next week. I'm going to do a couple shout outs before we leave here. And let's see who we have out there in Los Ideas Room.
Happy birthday, Najat.
It's Najat's birthday. Happy birthday.
It was
Wow.
the 3rd.
Fantastic. That's great. Let's see. Somebody said something about Pope John. Let's see. Remember, here comes Pope John II to America in 1998. This is what we need to pick up on. This is the gift that we got from Zelitsky on this. Let's use it. Yes. Igmu 2, James M, Bella Donella, Golden Warrior. Excellent program. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Hunt's face. Yeah, so recognizable indeed. And remember, somebody like Hunt thought, hey, like I'm in the right. I'm the one who's really defending America from these Kennedys who are going to destroy everything by being weak. Thank you, Sarah Ann. Happy birthday. Ted Rubenstein. Love the hot zone of good information brought to light. Thank you, sir. It's great to have you here. JM, great show as always. Thank you. Kate Garcia, happy birthday. Yes. Now that birthdays are going around, it's good. Happy birthday, Virgo. That's a good way to put it. Kevin Bauman, Corporal Salty, collective memory. Isn't that really what this comes down to? And it's very interesting. It almost gives away the theme of a show I have coming up for you later in September. And that is a Steiner show. So I think you're going to be happy about that one. Something quite remarkable. Let's see. Jessica Rodriguez. I couldn't imagine not being able to watch any and all episodes that some are not available on YouTube. So glad I'm a member. Thank you, Jessica. It's valuable to be a member. We've tried to make it accessible for everyone. And if you want to be a member of the show, go to darkjournalist.com. And we really appreciate your support. Caritas Tarot, of course. What a potent mind meld here. Fun episode. Yes, this is potent. And, Netflix, those people, it's kind of like a thin film on top that people can at least learn that there's a subject out there. But they do flimsy things. I thought having the guy in the Casolaro thing actually dress as Casolaro when he was investigating thing was so wrong-headed and shows the craziness of marketing when you get around things. And so I think counterfeit conspiracy is a good name for that stuff. And anyone can do what they want. It's I don't think you just want to hang around and judge everybody, but that, some of the stuff you have to look at and say, many of these people who get around the subject, they haven't spent the time with it. So, and there can be a lot of gimmicky things around it that I don't think suit this particular type of research. But we learn in all kinds of different ways. But yeah, some of that was hard to take. And the Kennedy specials, they seem really intent on all they want to do is show, he was womanizing. My God, painkillers, Dr. Feelgood. There's so much more to this guy. He revolutionized the world. Do you want to talk about revolutionaries? How about the idea that we're not going to enforce a Pax Americana of American weapons of war? That's revolutionary, I would say. And how about saving the world from nuclear destruction like he did during the missile crisis? I mean, yeah, let's talk about that. And, we'll leave Dr. Feelgood as just kind of a fun little anecdote. Okay. Great show. Keep safe. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Judy Morris. Are you WH DJ? How else would they keep you on YouTube? Now I'm trying to think of WH. White Hat?
Oh.
I think White Hat would work. Thank you, Judy. We appreciate your support. And hopefully, it's funny because a lot of people at a certain point, Netflix or YouTube was throwing people off left and right. And they were like, you should just leave the platform and protest. My whole thing was, look, I started the show on YouTube and I prefer it when they're not censoring me or anyone else. We've gone through intense censorship. But, if a big portion of my audience is here, I'm going to keep doing shows as long as it's available. That's the way that I look at it. Thank you. And thank you, Charlotte Key. Thanks for the information and stories DJ, and thank you for your generous donations as well. So those super chats count. Jackie Kennedy was innocent and beautiful, Golden Girl says. Isn't that true? Wow, we can't leave her out of the story. She was a remarkable, remarkable woman. And I think the whole nation learned a lot from her great style and her grace in dealing. My God, she was actually in the assassination, as we know. I mean, the guts of this woman, she's just an iron woman. White House, LOL. There you go. Fantastic. Wow. Great ideas from tonight. Charlotte Key, Belladonna. Let's see. Feel like I'm waiting for the censorship to end. Not sure if it ever will. I know. What a different everything would be so different without the censorship. It's ridiculous. And that includes the algorithms and all the technological things they think they're so smart doing behind the scenes. Let me tell you something. Before I did all of this wonderful stuff, I was an editor for a tech magazine for a while, and that whole kind of internet piece, I understood it quite well, and the things, and that kind of the power mad thing behind it too. And interacting with those people was very interesting, because you have to be humble. Even with great powers or great technological powers, and remember that you're impacting one person at a time. Carolyn Rose, thanks, DJ and Olivia. Whew, fantastic. I wanted to recommend a book. Let's see here. Oh yeah, it's called. It's about this, and it is a classic double cross, which gets some things right, but I don't. It does the whole CIA mafia thing. But there are some explosive pieces, I think, in there. So Double Cross is a good book for the mafia side. And on the other side, where is that? Oh, this is another one. The Last Word, My Indictment of the CIA and the Murder of JFK. There's the whole story of Marita Lorenz in here. And she, of course, was Castro's girlfriend. I didn't get to her tonight. Maybe I'll dedicate
or Lansky, which I know you researched also.
Oh yes, Lansky is very important. I probably will continue a part 2 with Lansky and Morenz back together again. And but there's so many interesting things in that Mark Lane book. This is his last book on the Kennedy assassination, but he pulls together some great strings. And there's a compilation of Atlantis readings. It's just called Atlantis, Edgar Cayce. And it's the readings, no commentary, nothing, which sometimes I think is good, because sometimes, it's good to have the research with commentary, but sometimes you just want the readings straight up. That's a fantastic book. This is interesting. Earth Changes Update. There's so many good things in here. This is a little book, and it came out in, I think, 1992. But it's just a little book that contains some very interesting updates on Casey's readings versus what was going on geographically. And I guess I'd be looking for one. I wish the ARE would do one of those now. That could be really useful. So maybe that new CEO can do that. What do you think?
That'd be great.
Fantastic. And Miss Olivia, bravo. Nicely done. Fantastic. Wise Guys in the Hot Zone, Castro Atlantis Mystery. Thank you so much for being here. We will be with you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend. Of course, it says in broadcast, but
never really ends.
It never really ends. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and look at Bobby joining forces with Trump to bring on a better future. Bobby, he's been doing incredible things, and I think he'll do incredible things in the future. So we'll see y'all next week.
God bless.